Chapter 1. The Arrival. The gravel road stretched into the distance, cutting through dense woods where the sunlight struggled to break through the tangled branches. Tiara's car hummed steadily as she drove deeper into isolation, the road narrowing with each passing mile. The trees closed in around her, casting elongated shadows that clung to the edges of the road like dark fingers reaching out. She glanced at the directions once more. The house, her new beginning, was just ahead. A rusted iron gate stood at the end of the road, half hidden by overgrown ivy and thick weeds. It creaked as it swung open with a nudge, revealing a path lined with stones, leading to a looming structure at the top of a gentle slope. The house stood like a brooding figure against the overcast sky, its windows dark and lifeless. Time had weathered the once grand exterior, peeling paint, sagging shutters, and a roof that dipped in places where the tiles had cracked or fallen away. The air felt heavier here, as if the very atmosphere clung with the weight of untold secrets. Tiara took a breath, ignoring the unease that twisted in her stomach. She had come too far to turn back now. She parked near the front steps, the car engine falling silent, leaving only the rustle of the wind in the trees. Grabbing her bags, she walked toward the house, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. The wooden steps groaned under her weight as she ascended, and the porch creaked, the sound echoing through the stillness. The front door, heavy and warped from years of neglect, resisted at first before giving way with a low, drawn-out creak. Inside, the air was stale and cool, carrying a faint odor of mildew and dust. The hallway was narrow, lined with faded wallpaper that curled at the edges, and the wooden floor creaked underfoot as she ventured further inside. Tiara paused in the center of the foyer, taking in the space. To her left was a parlor, its furniture draped in white sheets like ghostly figures waiting in silence. A cracked mirror hung on the wall above an empty fireplace, its surface clouded and scratched. To her right was a staircase, winding up into darkness. She felt the house watching her, its walls pressing in with a silent, oppressive presence. She shook off the chill running down her spine and moved into the kitchen. Rusted faucets, chipped tiles, and cobwebs in every corner greeted her. The fridge hummed weakly when she plugged it in, while the clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second louder than the last. Upstairs, the bedrooms waited, frozen in time. Dust clung to every surface, and the wallpaper, once vibrant with floral patterns, had faded to dull grays and browns. She dropped her bags on the bed in the master bedroom, the mattress sagging slightly as it took the weight. From the window, she could see the forest stretching endlessly, a sea of dark green that seemed to go on forever. Tiara spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the house. The rooms were numerous, each one colder and emptier than the last. A musty attic revealed stacks of old boxes, cobweb-laden furniture, and forgotten belongings left behind by past occupants. The basement, however, was different. The stairs creaked louder as she descended into the darkness below. The concrete floor was damp, and the walls were rough stone, seeping moisture in places. A single, bare bulb swung from the ceiling, casting long shadows that seemed to pulse with life. There was something off about the basement, a sense of wrongness that clung to the air. An old wooden door stood at the far end, its surface scarred and battered, as if something had tried desperately to break through from the other side. It was locked tight with a rusted chain, and she didn't dare touch it. The door seemed to watch her as she turned to leave, its presence lingering in the back of her mind like an unwelcome thought. Night came swiftly, casting the house in deep, unmoving shadows. Tiara lay in bed, the blankets pulled up tight, listening to the house settle around her. Creaks echoed through the walls, the sound of something shifting, moving just out of sight. The wind whispered against the windows, but it was the silence between the sounds that gnawed at her. the heavy, oppressive quiet that clung to the dark. Hours passed, sleep refusing to come. The darkness seemed thicker here, alive in its own way, pressing down on her like an unseen force. Her eyes fluttered shut for brief moments, only to snap open at every creak and groan. The house was old, that was all. It was just the house settling, she told herself. But deep down, in the pit of her stomach, Tiara felt it. The first stirrings of something wrong. Something that had been waiting for her all along, watching her from the shadows since she arrived. And as the night stretched on, the house remained awake, alive in its silence, waiting. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. The first night in the house ended without sleep. Tiara rose from bed with aching limbs, her eyes heavy and bloodshot from the hours spent tossing and turning. Pale morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. A chill hung in the air, despite the warmth promised by the sun outside. The house felt colder than before, as if it had drawn in the night's darkness and held onto it. She wandered downstairs to the kitchen. The old floorboards groaned beneath her bare feet, the creaks echoing through the empty rooms. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The hum of the fridge, the clink of her coffee mug as she set it down on the counter. The house was unnervingly still, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't empty. It was as if the walls themselves held breath, listening and waiting. As Tiara sat at the table, sipping her coffee, her gaze drifted to the windows. The glass was smudged and fogged from age, allowing only a murky view of the outside world. Beyond the window was the overgrown garden, a mess of tangled weeds and gnarled trees that leaned too close to the house. The branches scraped lightly against the siding, like fingernails on a chalkboard. Finishing her coffee, she decided to explore more of the house in the daylight. There was something uneasy about the shadows last night, how they clung to corners and stretched across rooms as if alive. Perhaps in the light, the unease would vanish, exposing the house as nothing more than an old structure in need of repair. She started with the parlor. The sunlight filtered through dusty curtains, illuminating particles that danced lazily in the air. She pulled the sheets off the furniture, revealing faded upholstery with intricate patterns now dulled by time. The mirror above the fireplace was cracked from top to bottom, distorting her reflection into fragments. The fireplace itself was cold. Ashes from a fire long gone settled in the grate. There was a photograph on the mantelpiece, black and white, its edges curled and yellowed with age. It depicted a family standing in front of the house. A man with stern eyes, a woman with a blank expression, and two children with hollow stares. Their faces seemed to follow her as she moved, their eyes burrowing into her. Tiara quickly looked away, her discomfort growing. There was something wrong with this place, something rooted in its very foundations. The upstairs rooms were much like the parlor, dusty, cluttered with relics of a forgotten time, and eerily quiet. The master bedroom was mostly as she'd left it, though she noticed that one of the closet doors now stood slightly ajar. She distinctly remembered closing it before going to bed. A draft, perhaps? She shrugged it off, trying to silence the creeping thoughts that gnawed at her mind. The bathroom down the hall was an unsettling mix of decay and remnants of former luxury. A clawfoot tub stood in the center, its porcelain stained with rust, while the sink was chipped and cracked. The mirror was coated with grime, reflecting nothing but shadowy outlines. Water dripped slowly from the faucet, each droplet splashing in the sink with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should. It was in the hallway, as she passed the stairs, that she first heard it, a faint whisper, barely a breath of sound. She froze, listening intently. The whisper came again, faint and distant, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, slipping through the walls and swirling in the air around her. The sound sent a shiver down her spine, her heart thudding in her chest. She cautiously descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. The whispering grew clearer the closer she got to the first floor. It was as though the house itself was murmuring secrets, words she couldn't quite make out, yet felt in her bones. The sound led her to the basement door, the old wooden planks worn smooth from years of touch. The chain still hung across it, rusted and secure, but the door seemed to pulse slightly, as if alive. She placed her hand on the door, feeling the cold radiate through the wood. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only the silence, thick and heavy. Her pulse quickened as the air grew colder, the shadows gathering in the corners, stretching toward her like dark tendrils. Something was down there, something hidden, something that didn't want to be disturbed. Backing away from the door, Tiara quickly turned and returned upstairs, the basement and its ominous presence left behind for now. She busied herself with cleaning the kitchen, trying to distract herself from the gnawing fear that grew with every passing minute. But no matter how hard she scrubbed, how she tried to focus on mundane tasks, that whisper remained in the back of her mind, taunting her, drawing her back to that door. As evening fell, the light in the house dimmed, shadows reclaiming the corners. She lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting dancing shapes on the walls. The whisper returned as soon as darkness crept in, more insistent this time, echoing softly through the house, curling into her ears like a cold breath. She could almost hear words in it now, fragments of something lost, something desperate. The house seemed to shift, groaning with the night as if waking from a long slumber. The once quiet, forgotten corners now throbbed with a sinister energy, the shadows deeper and more alive than before. Tiara huddled under her blankets, wide awake as the night stretched on. The whispering never ceased, a low murmur that twisted and coiled through the silence, a constant reminder that she was not alone. The hours dragged by, and the air in the room grew dense, pressing in on her like a smothering weight. The darkness outside was absolute, the moon hidden behind a thick shroud of clouds. The trees rustled in the wind, their branches scraping against the house like claws. The whispering became more pronounced, as if drawing closer, leaking through the walls and floorboards. Tiara's breath hitched as the shadows at the foot of her bed seemed to move, pooling together into a darker mass. Her heart raced as she stared into the blackness, waiting, listening. The whisper was right beside her now, a chill brushing across her skin. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing it to stop, but the house only grew colder, the whispers louder. Something unseen brushed her arm, cold and feather-light, and her eyes snapped open. The room was empty, yet the presence lingered, an icy, suffocating dread that filled the air. The whisper faded into silence, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing in the dark. And so the night wore on, the house alive with the murmur of hidden voices, the shadows watching with patient, hungry eyes. Chapter 3: The Locked Door. Morning brought a cold, gray light that bled through the fog clinging to the trees outside. Tiara awoke with a sense of dread, a lingering weight in her chest from the night before. The house was quiet now, but the memory of the whispers and the cold touch on her skin left her with an unease she couldn't shake. She forced herself out of bed, ignoring the stiffness in her limbs from another sleepless night. The house greeted her with silence, an oppressive stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. She moved through the hallways with cautious steps, as if expecting the shadows to leap out at her. But the house was motionless, waiting. It was a different kind of silence now, a watchful, patient one. Tiara busied herself with cleaning again, trying to bring some semblance of normalcy to the day. She scrubbed countertops, dusted shelves, and swept the floors. But no matter how much she worked, she couldn't rid the place of the sense of something wrong. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening as the day wore on. The distant creaks of settling wood and the occasional groan of the floorboards were constant reminders that the house was alive in ways it shouldn't be. By midday, she found herself drawn back to the basement door. It loomed at the end of the hallway, an unwelcome presence she couldn't ignore. The wooden boards were darkened with age, the rusted chain hanging loosely from the handle. The door almost seemed to pulse, as if something was breathing behind it, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. She stood in front of it, heart pounding in her chest. The air was colder here, as if all warmth had been sucked away. The whispering had returned, faint and far off, barely a breath of sound. It wasn't coming from the door directly, but from all around her, seeping through the walls like a slow, creeping fog. Her hand hovered over the chain, fingers trembling. Logic told her not to touch it. Some instinct buried deep within her warned her that opening this door would lead to something she could never undo. But the pull was stronger, a compulsion growing with every heartbeat. It was as though the house was urging her, whispering its desire to be set free, to unleash whatever was hidden in that dark place. Tiara snatched her hand back, backing away from the door, fighting against the urge that gnawed at her mind. She retreated into the kitchen, desperate to distance herself from the pull of the basement. The house seemed to sigh as she left, the whispering fading once more into silence. She spent the afternoon trying to distract herself, but her thoughts always returned to that door. The image of it lingered in her mind, its dark wood, the chain, the sense of something waiting just beyond it. The more she tried to focus on other tasks, the stronger the urge became to return, to finally face what lay behind it. Every creak in the floor, every shifting shadow seemed to be calling her back, guiding her down that hallway again. The hours dragged on, and soon the daylight began to fade, the sun sinking behind the trees. As the shadows lengthened, the house grew colder, the warmth of the day retreating with the light. The unease that had been simmering just below the surface all day returned in full force, crawling up her spine with icy fingers. By the time night fell, the house was drenched in darkness, the only light coming from the candles she'd lit in the living room. Their flickering flames cast wavering shapes on the walls, creating a dance of shadows that seemed almost purposeful. The whispering began again, this time more insistent, as though the house had grown impatient with her resistance. It swirled through the rooms, a low murmur that tugged at the edges of her consciousness. She could no longer resist the pull. With trembling hands, Tiara grabbed a flashlight and made her way down the hallway. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, the creak of the floorboards stretching out into the darkened air. The basement door waited for her, looming at the end of the corridor like a sentinel guarding some forbidden secret. She stood before it once more, feeling the cold radiating from it. The chain hung there, rusted and brittle, offering little resistance should she choose to remove it. The whispers were louder now, more coherent, though still impossible to fully understand. They seemed to be coming from beneath the door, seeping through the cracks in the wood. Tiara's breath came in shallow bursts as she reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the chain. She hesitated, every nerve screaming at her to stop, to turn back. But the whispers drowned out those warnings, urging her onward. With a trembling hand, she unhooked the chain, the rust flaking away as it fell to the floor with a dull clatter. The sound echoed through the house, almost like a sigh of relief. The door creaked open, revealing a yawning darkness beyond. Her flashlight's beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the rough stone steps leading down into the basement. The air that wafted up from below was thick and stale, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something far more unpleasant, an odor that made her stomach twist in disgust. She descended the steps slowly, the light from her flashlight flickering in the cold air. The walls of the basement were rough stone, the ceiling low and dripping with moisture. The deeper she went, the stronger the stench became, an acrid mix of decay and rot that seemed to cling to the back of her throat. The whispering had grown louder, more distinct, coming from all around her, yet still without form. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a wide chamber. The floor was dirt, uneven and littered with debris, broken furniture, old crates, and rusted tools. But it was what stood at the far end of the room that made her freeze in place. Another door, smaller, almost hidden in the shadows. This one was older, its wood rotting and splintered, as if something had been gnawing at it for years. Dark stains marred the surface, forming patterns that could almost be letters or symbols, though they were too distorted to recognize. The whispers surged from behind this door, more frantic now, as if they knew she was close to unlocking whatever lay trapped within. Tiara took a step closer, her heartbeat thunderous in her ears. The air around her seemed to vibrate with tension, the walls pressing in as though they were alive, watching her every move. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into her bones, making her teeth chatter. She reached out with trembling fingers, her skin prickling as she neared the door. But before she could touch it, a gust of icy wind rushed through the basement, snuffing out her flashlight. Darkness swallowed her whole, and the whispers rose into a cacophony of voices. Screams, sobs, desperate pleas for help. She staggered back, her hands fumbling to relight the flashlight, her mind spinning with terror. When the light finally flickered back on, the basement was empty. The whispers had stopped, leaving only a suffocating silence in their wake. The small door stood still, mocking her, daring her to come closer. But she couldn't. Not now. She turned and fled up the stairs, the beam of her flashlight shaking as she hurried back to the safety of the main floor. The basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, the sound echoing through the house like a final warning. Tiara leaned against the wall, breathless, her heart racing. The house had grown colder, the darkness in the corners more menacing. She knew she wouldn't be able to avoid that door forever. It was only a matter of time before the house made her return, and deep within the shadows of the basement, something stirred, waiting. Chapter 4. The Unseen Eyes. The next morning arrived with a thick, oppressive fog that clung to the house like a shroud. The sun struggled to break through, casting only a weak, sickly light that barely reached through the windows. Tiara's sleep had been fitful, plagued by nightmares she couldn't quite remember upon waking, though their residue left a lingering sense of dread clinging to her like cobwebs. She tried to shake it off as she moved through her morning routine. The coffee tasted bitter, the toast dry and unappetizing. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the scrape of her chair against the tiles, the distant hum of the refrigerator. Silence pooled in the corners, heavy and watchful. The whispers had faded, but the sense of something lurking just out of sight remained. Tiara's thoughts kept circling back to the basement and that small, hidden door. The memory of the whispering voices, the gnawing rot of the wood, and the oppressive cold gnawed at her mind like a festering wound. She knew she shouldn't go back down there, that something terrible awaited her if she did. But the pull was still there, growing stronger with every passing minute. Desperate to distract herself, she decided to explore the upper floors of the house more thoroughly. She hadn't ventured beyond the first floor and her bedroom since arriving, avoiding the shadowed hallways and creaking stairs out of some instinctual fear. But now, anything was better than dwelling on what lay below. The staircase leading to the second floor groaned beneath her weight, the banister splintered and worn smooth by years of use. As she ascended, the air grew cooler, the light dimmer. The second floor was much like the first. A long hallway lined with closed doors, thick dust coating the floor, and faded wallpaper peeling from the walls in ragged strips. The windows were cloudy, their glass warped and streaked with grime, allowing only faint, distorted shapes of the trees outside to be visible. She started with the nearest room, slowly turning the tarnished brass knob and pushing the door open. It swung inward with a long, mournful creak, revealing a small bedroom. The room was sparsely furnished, a narrow bed with a rusted metal frame, a chipped dresser, and a wardrobe that loomed in the corner like a forgotten sentinel. Cobwebs draped from the ceiling like ghostly curtains, and the stale air carried the scent of mildew and dust. The bed's thin mattress was stained, its fabric torn in places, exposing yellowed stuffing beneath. The dresser drawers were stuck, the wood warped from years of neglect, but Tiara managed to pry one open. Inside were crumbling papers, faded photographs, and a small wooden box. The photographs were yellowed and cracked, showing a family, likely the same one from the picture she'd seen downstairs, standing in front of the house. The father's stern expression, the mother's vacant gaze, and the children's hollow eyes sent a shiver down her spine. She turned her attention to the box, lifting it carefully from the drawer. It was small, about the size of a jewelry box, and carved with intricate designs that were nearly worn away by time. The lid creaked as she opened it, revealing a collection of trinkets, a tarnished locket, a broken pocket watch, and a small key. The key was old and rusted, its purpose unclear, but something about it seemed significant. She pocketed it, unsure of why she felt compelled to keep it. The next few rooms were much the same, dusty, forgotten spaces filled with decaying remnants of lives long past. A child's room with a crib draped in cobwebs, a guest room with furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts, a study with shelves full of moldy, unreadable books. But it was the final room at the end of the hall that made her pause. The door was different from the others, thicker, reinforced with metal bands, and marked with deep gouges as if something had scratched at it desperately. The doorknob was cold to the touch, a sharp chill that bit into her skin even through her clothing. Her heartbeat quickened as she grasped the knob and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in shadow. The windows were boarded up from the inside, only thin slivers of light penetrating the cracks. The walls were bare, the wallpaper stripped away, leaving exposed wooden beams darkened with age and moisture. The floor was uneven, dirt and debris scattered across it as though something had been dragged across the room repeatedly. In the center of the room, a circle was carved into the floor, its lines jagged and uneven. Symbols and markings were scratched into the wood, their meaning lost to time. The air was thick with a musty scent, mingling with something acrid and metallic. The stench of decay and rot lingered, as if something had died here and never been properly laid to rest. As Tiara stepped further inside, the temperature plummeted. Her breath misted in the air, and goosebumps prickled her skin. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the room was closing in on itself. The shadows seemed thicker here, darker and more substantial, pressing in from all sides. Her gaze was drawn to the far wall, where something caught her eye. There, half hidden in the darkness, was a mirror, cracked and filthy. It was large, taking up nearly the entire wall, its ornate frame tarnished and dull. The surface was smeared with grime, but she could just make out her own distorted reflection staring back at her, twisted and warped by the cracks that ran through the glass. But it wasn't her reflection that made her blood run cold. It was the eyes, dozens of them, staring out from behind the cracks, watching her from within the glass. They blinked in unison, unblinking and full of malice, following her every move as she stood frozen in place. The whispering started again, soft at first, then growing louder, more urgent. The eyes blinked in rhythm with the whispers, as if communicating in some ancient, forgotten language. Tiara stumbled back, nearly tripping over the uneven floor. The whispering grew into a cacophony, a chorus of voices rising and falling in eerie harmony. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple, as though it were a thin veil separating her from whatever was trapped within. The eyes moved closer, pressing against the glass, their pupils dark and endless voids. The urge to flee overwhelmed her, and she bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Her heart raced as she leaned against the door, the whispers muffled but still audible, seeping through the wood like smoke. She could still feel those eyes on her, even from the other side of the door, watching, waiting. She ran down the hallway, the shadows twisting and stretching around her as if trying to pull her back. She could feel the house closing in, its malevolent presence pressing against her, urging her back to that room, back to the basement. She knew now that whatever was in this house was far more than just whispers in the dark. It was alive, aware, and hungry. By the time she reached the stairs, she was gasping for breath, her chest tight with fear. The temperature continued to drop, the chill burrowing deep into her bones. She grabbed onto the banister and stumbled down the steps, desperate to put as much distance between herself and that room as possible. When she finally reached the first floor, she collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The house had gone silent again, but the presence lingered, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for her to slip, to return to those darkened rooms where it could reach her. And yet, despite the overwhelming terror, she couldn't shake the compulsion to go back. The house was drawing her deeper, pulling her towards something hidden, something that had been waiting for someone like her. She pulled the small key from her pocket, turning it over in her hand. It was cold to the touch, almost like it had been waiting for her to find it. The key was for something in this house. She could feel it. Whether it was connected to the basement, the locked rooms, or something else entirely, she didn't know. But she was certain it would open a door she was not meant to unlock, one that would lead her straight into the heart of the house's darkness. As the fog outside thickened and the sun disappeared behind a veil of gray, Tiara knew one thing with absolute certainty. The eyes were still watching, and they would not stop until she found the door that key belonged to. Chapter 5. The Midnight Vigil. Night settled over the house like a suffocating blanket, thick and impenetrable. Outside, the fog had grown denser, a swirling mass of shadows that pressed against the windows, distorting the view of the world beyond. The house was a fortress of silence, its walls seeming to absorb all sound, leaving nothing but the steady thrum of Tiara's heartbeat and the occasional creak of old wood. Tiara had tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, the images of the day returned. The mirror with its watching eyes, the twisted reflections, the whispers that seemed to cling to her even now. She lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. The small key she had found sat on the nightstand beside her, its presence a constant reminder of the house's secrets. Time dragged on, the minutes stretching into hours. The darkness outside was absolute, a void without end. The only light in her room came from the flickering candles she had placed by the window, their flames trembling as if they, too, were afraid of what lurked in the shadows. The air had grown colder, the chill seeping through the walls and into her bones. The house was awake, its presence more palpable than ever, waiting in the stillness of the night. Then, just as she thought she might drift off, she heard it, the sound of movement. Faint at first, like the rustle of fabric or the scuffle of feet against the floorboards. It came from somewhere below, distant but unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat, and she sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, a soft, almost rhythmic thudding, like someone or something was pacing back and forth. She knew the source of the noise was coming from the basement. The thought of returning there sent a wave of dread washing over her, but the compulsion was stronger now, almost irresistible. The house wanted her to go back, and it was using the noise to draw her in. Unable to resist, Tiara got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight, its weight a small comfort in the growing darkness. She slipped the key into her pocket, feeling its cold metal press against her thigh as she made her way out of the bedroom and into the hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still air. The house seemed to be holding its breath, the very walls tense with anticipation. The shadows in the hallway shifted as she moved, elongating and twisting as if they were alive. The faint light of the flashlight barely cut through the gloom, the beam flickering every few steps as if struggling to stay lit. She reached the top of the stairs and peered down into the inky blackness below. The thudding had stopped now, leaving only a heavy silence in its wake. But she knew it was just waiting for her to descend, waiting for her to take the bait. Slowly, she made her way down the stairs, each step more deliberate than the last. The air grew thicker, colder, with every inch she descended. By the time she reached the first floor, she was shivering, her breath visible in the icy air. She paused at the entrance to the basement, the door looming before her like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. The chain she had removed earlier still lay on the floor, a rusted remnant of whatever had once been trapped behind that door. The handle was cold to the touch as she gripped it, steeling herself for what lay beyond. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing the yawning blackness of the basement stairs. The flashlight's beam wavered as she pointed it down into the depths, revealing the rough stone walls and the steps leading into the abyss. The scent of decay hit her immediately, stronger now, as if whatever had been rotting down there had only grown more putrid. She took a deep breath and began her descent. The walls seemed to close in as she moved deeper into the basement, the ceiling pressing down as the darkness thickened. Each step echoed in the confined space, the sound bouncing off the stone and returning to her in distorted whispers. At the bottom, the chamber lay waiting, just as she had left it. The debris, the broken furniture, the uneven dirt floor, all were unchanged, as if frozen in time. But the small door at the far end seemed different now, somehow more menacing. The symbols carved into the wood were clearer, the dark stains more vivid. The whispers had returned, swirling around her like a faint breeze, urging her to approach. Tiara's fingers brushed against the key in her pocket, her mind torn between fear and curiosity. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee this place and never return. But the pull was irresistible, dragging her forward despite the terror gnawing at her insides. She approached the small door, the whispers growing louder with each step. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her chest tight with anticipation. The door's wood was rough beneath her fingers, cold and damp, as though it had been sealed for centuries. The keyhole was small, almost hidden among the scratches and stains. With trembling hands, she pulled out the key and hesitated for just a moment before sliding it into the lock. The fit was perfect, the metal scraping as it slid into place. A heavy click echoed through the chamber as the lock disengaged, the sound almost deafening in the stillness. For a moment, she stood frozen, unable to move, her heart pounding in her ears. The door seemed to pulse beneath her hand, a subtle vibration that matched the rhythm of her racing heart. She knew that whatever was behind this door was not meant to be seen, not meant to be freed. But it was too late now. The house had brought her here for a reason, and there was no turning back. With a slow, deliberate motion, she turned the handle and pulled the door open. A rush of cold air blasted out, carrying with it the stench of rot and something far worse, a foulness that made her gag. The flashlight's beam flickered wildly as she aimed it into the darkness beyond, revealing a narrow tunnel that stretched far beyond the reach of the light. The walls were dirt, packed tight, with roots twisting through the earth like black veins. The floor was uneven, littered with what looked like fragments of bones and scraps of cloth. The whispers surged, filling the tunnel with a low, throbbing hum that reverberated in her skull. She took a hesitant step forward, the light barely illuminating the path ahead. The air grew colder still, the chill biting into her skin, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel something ahead of her, something ancient and malevolent, waiting in the depths of the tunnel. As she moved deeper, the walls seemed to close in, the tunnel narrowing until she had to crouch to continue. The earth pressed against her from all sides, suffocating, the weight of the house above bearing down on her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the very dirt was speaking to her, urging her onward. Then, in the distance, she saw it, a faint glow, pale and sickly, emanating from somewhere deep within the tunnel. It pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, casting long shadows on the dirt walls. She inched closer, her mind racing with dread and curiosity. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, its walls slick with moisture. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, worn smooth by time. Upon it lay an object wrapped in tattered cloth, its shape indistinct but radiating a malevolent energy. The glow emanated from the object, pulsing in time with the whispers, which had risen to a fever pitch, filling the chamber with their dissonant chant. Tiara's hands trembled as she reached out, compelled by a force she couldn't resist. The moment her fingers brushed the cloth, a shock ran through her, and the whispers stopped abruptly. Silence fell, heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small, blackened box, its surface etched with runes and symbols that seemed to writhe beneath her touch. The box pulsed with a dark energy, vibrating in her hands. She knew she should leave it there, walk away and never look back, but she couldn't. The compulsion was too strong. As she lifted the box, the tunnel behind her began to rumble, the walls shaking as if the earth itself was rebelling against what she had done. Dirt and debris rained down from above, the ceiling cracking and groaning. The light from the box grew stronger, casting twisted shadows that danced on the walls. Tiara turned and ran, clutching the box to her chest as the tunnel collapsed around her. The earth seemed to reach out, trying to drag her back into the darkness. The whispers returned, more frenzied now, their tones filled with anger and desperation. She could feel something behind her, pursuing her, closing in with every step. She barely made it back to the basement stairs before the tunnel caved in completely, sealing whatever horrors lay within back into the earth. The door slammed shut behind her, the keyhole glowing faintly before going dark. Breathless and covered in dirt, Tiara collapsed onto the floor, the box still clutched tightly in her hands. The house was silent once more, but the presence was stronger now, more palpable. She had brought something back with her, something that was never meant to be freed. As she lay there, staring up at the cracked ceiling, the whispers began again, softer this time, almost soothing. They spoke of promises, deals made in desperate moments, sealed with blood and whispered words. The pages of the journal told of those who sought power and knowledge at the cost of their very souls, drawn to this house by a force older than time itself. The writing grew frantic, with scrawled warnings and cryptic symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The author had become consumed by the darkness they had courted, their descent into madness meticulously documented in the lines that danced across the brittle pages. Tiara felt her heartbeat quicken as she continued reading, her eyes moving faster as if racing against an unseen clock. The shadows around her seemed to deepen, shifting in the periphery of her vision. The house creaked softly, settling into an unnatural stillness that made the air thick with unease. The walls, once merely old wood and plaster, now felt like living things, breathing, watching. The journal described rituals meant to bind and contain whatever lurked beneath the earth. The box was a key, but not just any key. It was both a lock and a doorway, a nexus between worlds that had been sealed away for a reason. The notes hinted at a presence, something vast and hungry, clawing at the edges of reality, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Those who had come before had only delayed the inevitable, each generation leaving behind traces of their struggle in the walls, in the very foundation of the house. Tiara's hand trembled as she turned the page. A sketch, rough and hastily drawn, depicted the box, its runes glowing with a faint, eerie light, much like they had in the basement. Below it, in shaky handwriting, was a single phrase repeated over and over. Do not let it out. But she already had. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. Tiara froze, gripping the journal tightly, her breath caught in her throat. The whispers returned, louder this time, persistent, urging her to listen, to obey. They seeped from the walls, from the floorboards, a chorus of voices overlapping in an unintelligible murmur that vibrated through her bones. Something moved in the shadows, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a chill racing down her spine. The box on the table emitted a faint hum, vibrating as though something inside it was alive and restless. The runes on its surface pulsed with a sickly light, growing brighter with each passing second. Panic clawed at Tiara's mind. She needed to stop this, to reverse whatever had been set in motion, but the journal offered no solutions, only warnings and fragmented accounts of failure. The final entries were barely coherent, descending into gibberish as the writer's sanity crumbled under the weight of what they had unleashed. The last page was smeared with dark stains, the ink bleeding into the paper like blood, and in the center was a single word, underlined repeatedly. Run. But where could she run? The house had become a labyrinth of dread, and Tiara knew deep down that leaving wasn't an option. The house wouldn't allow it. She was tied to it now, just as those before her had been, bound by the choices she had already made. Another loud creak echoed through the house, followed by the sound of something shifting, like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor above her. Tiara's gaze snapped toward the ceiling, but all she saw were shadows crawling along the edges of the room, as if they had a life of their own. Her mind raced, but every rational thought was drowned out by the rising tide of fear. Suddenly, the box shook violently, knocking itself off the table and crashing to the floor. The impact sent it skidding across the room, stopping just shy of the wall. The runes flared to life, glowing with a fierce intensity, and the lid began to rattle as though something inside was desperately trying to escape. Tiara backed away instinctively, her eyes wide with horror. Whatever was contained in that box was no longer satisfied with remaining imprisoned. The whispers swelled into a cacophony, each voice distinct now, speaking in a language she didn't understand but felt deep in her bones. They called to her, luring her closer, promising power, knowledge, and release from fear if only she would submit. For a brief moment, the temptation was overwhelming, an offer to escape the terror that gripped her. But beneath those promises lay something darker, a bottomless pit of despair and malevolence that threatened to swallow her whole. Tiara forced herself to resist, shaking her head as if trying to dispel the voices. She couldn't let whatever was in that box take control. She had to find a way to seal it again, to bury it deep where it could never reach the surface. The lights flickered once more, and a low rumble shook the house. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the shadows writhed more violently, twisting into grotesque shapes that loomed over her like specters from a nightmare. The box slid a few inches closer to her, its lid cracking open ever so slightly, revealing a sliver of darkness so profound that it seemed to devour the light around it. Tiara's chest tightened as an icy dread washed over her. She had to act now. She lunged for the box, intending to slam the lid shut, but the moment her fingers brushed against its surface, a surge of cold energy shot through her arm, paralyzing her with fear. Her vision blurred, and for an instant, she saw something. An entity, vast and incomprehensible, staring back at her from within the void. Its gaze was infinite, devoid of compassion, filled only with hunger. The shadows closed in, circling her like predators, and the box vibrated violently in her grasp. Tiara gathered every ounce of willpower and forced herself to push the lid shut, sealing the darkness back inside. The runes dimmed, their glow fading to a faint pulse, and the whispers receded, leaving behind a ringing silence. For a moment, Tiara remained frozen, her hands trembling on the box, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The room was still, the shadows retreating to their corners, but the sense of impending doom lingered. She knew she had only bought herself time. Whatever was in that box wasn't fully contained, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. As the storm raged outside and the house groaned in protest, Tiara realized that the true battle had only just begun. The darkness beneath the earth was patient, and it would wait for the right moment to strike again. But Tiara would be ready. She had to be. The house demanded it, and now there was no escaping its grip. Chapter 6: Echoes of the Past. The dawn arrived slowly, filtering through thick clouds that shrouded the sky in a dull, gray light. Tiara lay awake, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The events of the previous night had carved themselves deep into her mind. Every sound, every sensation, etched into her memory with relentless clarity. The blackened box sat on the floor beside her bed, a silent reminder of what she had unearthed in the basement. It was heavy with a sinister aura, seeming to throb gently as though it had a pulse of its own. She forced herself to sit up, every muscle stiff from the tension that gripped her all night. Her skin felt clammy, and a chill clung to the air even as the day broke. The room was oppressive, filled with an unshakable sense of being watched. The shadows, even in the daylight, seemed deeper, stretching further into the corners of the room where the light dared not reach. The mirror across the room reflected a warped, distorted image, her own face blurred and stretched, almost unrecognizable. She couldn't stay in that room any longer. It felt as though the very walls were closing in on her, squeezing out the air. The whispers she had heard in the tunnel the night before echoed faintly in her mind, a low murmur at the edge of her consciousness. They were not words she understood, but the intent behind them was clear. Whatever she had disturbed, it was only the beginning. Tiara dressed hastily and left the room, clutching the box tightly under her arm. Her steps were slow and measured as she descended the stairs, careful not to make too much noise, as though afraid that the house itself might react. The house was still, yet it felt alive, as if it was waiting for her next move. The very air felt thicker, resisting every breath. Downstairs, the living room was dim despite the daylight outside. Dust particles hung suspended in the air, swirling gently in the weak shafts of light that pierced through the heavy curtains. She moved slowly, the box clutched to her chest as though it might leap from her hands if she relaxed her grip. Her eyes darted to every shadow, every darkened corner, expecting something to shift or move. She needed answers, some explanation for what was happening. There had to be something in this house that could tell her more about the history behind the strange events. Her mind wandered to the old books and forgotten relics in the study she had avoided so far. She hadn't dared venture in there before, but now it seemed her only option. The study was tucked away at the back of the house, its door slightly ajar as if beckoning her inside. Dust lined the edges of the doorframe, untouched for years. Tiara hesitated for a moment, feeling a sharp pang of dread, but then she stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and mildew. Bookshelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of leather-bound volumes that looked as ancient as the house itself. The windows were covered in grime, allowing only the faintest hint of light to penetrate the room. She set the box down on the desk in the center of the room, its presence casting an eerie shadow across the surface. The room was packed with objects, trinkets, weathered photos in cracked frames, and stacks of yellowed papers cluttering every available space. It was as if time had forgotten this room, leaving it to wither in decay. Tiara's attention was drawn to an old leather journal resting on the desk. The cover was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, the spine creaking as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, the pages were filled with cramped handwriting, lines and lines of notes, diagrams, and strange symbols. The writing was disjointed, frantic in places, as though the author had been in a state of distress. Flipping through the pages, she found references to the house, to rituals, to the very box she had unearthed. The notes were a fragmented narrative, telling of someone who had lived in the house years ago. A scholar, it seemed, who had become obsessed with unlocking the secrets buried beneath the house. The journal described hidden passages, ancient seals, and a presence that had been trapped within the earth, a malevolent force that had been contained at great cost. The author's obsession had driven them to attempt to control it, to bend it to their will. The final entries were erratic, filled with warnings and pleas, urging anyone who found the journal to leave the house and never return. But the warnings had come too late. The last few pages were smeared with ink and what looked like dried blood, the writing descending into incoherence, scratches and symbols that seemed to twist and writhe on the paper. Tiara felt a shiver crawl down her spine as she realized that whatever had happened to the author had not ended well. She closed the journal and glanced at the box again, its dark surface still pulsing with a sickly glow. The runes etched into it matched some of the symbols in the journal, and it was clear now that it was meant to contain something that was never meant to be freed. Yet she had opened the door, and the box had been disturbed. The house groaned suddenly, the sound reverberating through the walls like a deep, mournful sigh. Tiara tensed, her eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to lengthen and twist, as though something was stirring within them. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and her breath fogged in the chill. She backed away from the desk, her instinct screaming that she was not alone. The shadows at the edges of the room quivered as if something was trying to break free, to claw its way into the light. The whispers returned, more insistent this time, hissing from every corner, slithering into her ears. They were no longer distant. They were all around her, circling like predators waiting for her to make a mistake. The box rattled on the desk, vibrating violently as though trying to break apart. Tiara froze, watching in horror as the lid began to lift ever so slightly, revealing a glimpse of utter darkness inside, a void that seemed to swallow the light around it. The runes glowed brighter, flickering like dying embers. Without thinking, Tiara grabbed the box and shoved it back into the cloth she had wrapped it in earlier, desperate to seal it away once more. The whispers faltered, then retreated slightly, as if momentarily appeased. The shadows stilled, though the oppressive atmosphere lingered, weighing heavily on her chest. She fled the study, clutching the box tightly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The house creaked and groaned as she passed through the hallway, as though it was waking up, stretching its limbs after years of dormancy. The very structure seemed to be alive, pulsing with a dark energy that radiated from the box she carried. Back in the living room, she dropped the box onto a table, unsure of what to do next. Every instinct told her to leave, to abandon the house and never look back. But something stronger held her there. A twisted curiosity mixed with the knowledge that leaving might only make things worse. The house wouldn't let her go that easily, not now. The afternoon light outside dimmed as clouds gathered, thickening into a storm that seemed to echo the turmoil within the house. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first raindrops splattered against the windows. The box sat silently on the table, but its presence was undeniable. Tiara could feel it, a pulsating dread that gnawed at her from within. She knew she was running out of time. Whatever she had disturbed was growing stronger, and it wouldn't be long before it broke free entirely. She had to find a way to undo what had been done, to contain the evil before it consumed her completely. But as the storm outside raged and the shadows in the house deepened, Tiara realized that the path ahead was not one she could escape. The house had chosen her, and the darkness within it was bound to her now. There was no turning back, only the inevitable descent into the unknown. The whispers returned, growing louder as the storm swelled, their hissing voices filling the house. They no longer seemed content to remain hidden in the shadows. The walls trembled, and the lights flickered. Tiara clutched her head, trying to block out the noise, but it was futile. The house had awakened, and it was hungry. The storm outside lashed against the windows, and the shadows danced wildly on the walls. As the darkness closed in, Tiara knew that the worst was yet to come. Chapter 7. The Marking of Shadows. The days began to blend into one another, the passage of time losing meaning within the house's oppressive walls. Tiara's sleep was fractured, haunted by nightmares that clung to her waking hours like a persistent fog. The shadows in the house seemed to pulse with life, expanding and contracting with an unsettling rhythm. The air carried a heaviness that felt almost tangible, like a thick miasma pressing down on her chest, constricting her breath. She spent most of her time in a state of restless vigilance, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her from just beyond the edge of her vision. Even in the daylight, the house held a gloom that not even the sun could penetrate. It was as if the walls absorbed the light, swallowing it whole and spitting it back out as darkness. The journal had provided little in the way of concrete solutions. Its pages were a chaotic blend of warnings, symbols, and half-finished thoughts, spiraling further into madness with each entry. Tiara had scoured every page, desperate for some hint of how to end the growing threat that lurked within the box. But the answers remained elusive, buried beneath layers of cryptic ramblings that made her skin crawl. The box itself had become an ominous fixture in the living room. No matter how much she tried to avoid it, her eyes were constantly drawn to it. It sat there, quiet but potent, as if biding its time. The runes on its surface were dim now, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat, an insidious reminder that it was still very much alive. The shadows in the house had grown bolder. They no longer simply lurked in corners or crept along the edges of rooms. They reached out, stretching toward her like hungry tendrils. At first, it was subtle, a darkening in the periphery of her vision, a flicker of movement that disappeared when she turned to look. But now, they twisted and writhed openly, as if testing the limits of their confinement. One evening, as Tiara stood in the kitchen staring blankly out the window, she noticed a faint outline of something etched into the glass. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the surface, and saw what looked like a handprint, a smudged, elongated mark as if someone, or something, had pressed its palm against the window from the inside. The realization sent a chill through her. She recoiled, her pulse quickening as her mind raced. The handprint wasn't human. It was distorted, the fingers unnaturally long and crooked, the edges smeared as though it had been dragged across the glass. Tiara backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. The house creaked in response, a groaning sound that resonated through the walls, as if it was acknowledging her fear. The shadows along the ceiling began to twist and coil, forming grotesque shapes that defied logic. A maw of teeth, a cluster of eyes, all writhing in silent torment. She could feel them watching her, waiting for her next move. In a panic, she fled to the living room. The box was there, its presence dominating the space like a tumor growing in the heart of the house. The runes glowed briefly as she approached, responding to her anxiety, as if it could sense her turmoil. Tiara hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the morbid compulsion to confront whatever malevolent force had been unleashed. The journal's final entry flashed in her mind. The plea to run, the desperate scribbles that warned against staying in the house any longer. But she was past the point of running. The house had drawn her in too deeply, entwining itself with her very being. There was nowhere she could go where it wouldn't follow. As night fell, the house seemed to sink into a deeper darkness than ever before. The temperature plummeted, and a thin layer of frost began to form on the windows, creeping across the glass like skeletal fingers. Tiara huddled in the living room, her eyes fixed on the box. The shadows gathered around it, swirling in slow, hypnotic patterns, forming shapes that flickered in and out of existence. A figure crouching in the corner, a face leering from the darkness, all fading before she could fully register them. The floorboards creaked above her, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth. It was as if someone, or something, was trapped between the walls, eternally wandering in search of escape. The sound grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the house until it felt as if the entire structure was reverberating with its rhythmic thuds. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped and silence fell. A silence so complete that it rang in Tiara's ears. Then, slowly, from the direction of the staircase, came a low scraping sound, like nails dragging along wood. It grew closer, accompanied by a faint shuffling noise, as though something was crawling down the stairs, inching toward her with agonizing slowness. Tiara's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the source of the noise. Her eyes were wide, locked on the darkened hallway that led to the stairs. The shadows there were thicker, almost liquid in their density, swirling like a black tide. And then, from that inky void, she saw it, a figure, barely distinguishable from the darkness itself, slowly emerging into view. It was hunched, misshapen, its limbs elongated and twisted in unnatural angles. Its face was obscured, a void of darkness where features should have been, yet Tiara could feel its gaze piercing through her, a cold, malignant presence that seeped into her very soul. The creature's movements were jerky, as if it were struggling against invisible restraints, but it kept coming, dragging itself closer inch by inch, its limbs scraping against the floor. Tiara was paralyzed, her body refusing to obey as fear took hold. The creature paused at the edge of the room, lingering just within the shadows, as though testing the boundary between it and the light. The box on the table hummed with renewed energy, its runes flaring to life in response to the presence of the creature. It was as if the box was calling to it, drawing it closer with a siren's lure. The air grew heavier, thick with a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. The shadows writhed around the creature, tendrils stretching out toward Tiara like fingers reaching for prey. The whispers returned, not as a distant murmur but as a chorus of voices, overlapping in a discordant symphony that clawed at her sanity. They demanded her attention, pulling her focus between the box, the creature, and the shadows that loomed ever closer. With a surge of adrenaline, Tiara stumbled backward, her gaze never leaving the creature. She knew that she had to do something, anything, to keep it from crossing the threshold into the room. Her eyes darted to the box, the source of everything that had gone wrong. But what could she do with it? Destroy it? Hide it? Every option seemed futile in the face of the creeping horror that now stood at the precipice. The creature shifted, as if sensing her hesitation, and took another step forward. The shadows followed in its wake, spiraling around it in a dance of darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, drilling into her mind with a single command. Open the box. It was a trap. Tiara knew it. Yet the compulsion was nearly unbearable. The runes on the box glowed brighter, urging her to obey, promising an end to the torment if only she would give in. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. Whatever lay inside the box was far worse than the creature that now threatened her. She had already made the mistake of releasing it once. She couldn't risk it happening again. Gathering what little resolve she had left, Tiara turned and bolted from the living room, racing through the hallway and up the stairs. The house groaned in protest, the walls shuddering as she ran, but she didn't stop. The sound of the creature's scraping footsteps followed her, growing louder with each step she took. She reached the upstairs landing, her mind a frantic blur as she searched for a place to hide. The shadows up here were thicker, almost alive, twisting and writhing along the walls. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a breath on the back of her neck, sending shivers down her spine. Tiara dashed into one of the bedrooms and slammed the door shut behind her. The room was frigid, the air thick with the scent of decay. She pressed her back against the door, listening for any sign of the creature. But the house was silent, eerily so. The only sound was her own ragged breathing and the pounding of her heart. Minutes stretched into eternity as she waited, every nerve on edge. The shadows in the room were still, but the sense of being watched never left her. She knew the creature was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the moment to strike. It was only a matter of time before it found her. But it wasn't just the creature she had to worry about. The house itself was alive, a malevolent force that pulsed with dark energy. And the box, wherever it was now, remained the heart of it all, a conduit for something ancient and insidious. Tiara knew she was running out of options. She couldn't fight what she didn't understand, and every attempt to outmaneuver the darkness only seemed to draw her deeper into its grasp. She was trapped, caught in a web spun by forces far beyond her comprehension. The shadows in the room shifted subtly, a ripple of movement. That caught her eye. Tiara turned her gaze toward the corner, where the darkness seemed to coalesce into a more defined shape, a dark silhouette that loomed menacingly. It was as though the very shadows were gathering to form something more tangible, more sinister. As she watched, the shape began to take on a more recognizable form, emerging from the darkness with deliberate slowness. It was a figure, cloaked in shadows, its outline indistinct but clearly humanoid. The entity moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, its presence making the air grow colder with each step. Tiara's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the door, her eyes locked on the figure. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows elongating and curling like living tendrils. The figure approached with an almost deliberate intent, its movements smooth and unhurried, as if savoring the fear it instilled. The shadows around the figure twisted and contorted, creating an eerie halo of darkness that flickered with intermittent bursts of light. The light, however, was not natural. It had a sickly hue, pulsating like a dying ember. It cast grotesque, shifting patterns on the walls, turning the room into a distorted funhouse of fears. Tiara searched for a means of defense, but the room was devoid of anything that could help. The furniture was sparse, an old, sagging bed, a cracked dresser, and a broken chair. None of it offered any comfort or security. The figure drew closer, its silhouette becoming more defined, though its features remained shrouded in darkness. It was as if the very shadows were a cloak, obscuring its true form. Suddenly, a soft, whispering sound filled the room. A symphony of faint voices, indistinguishable yet layered, rising and falling in a haunting melody. The whispers seemed to emanate from the figure itself, weaving into the very fabric of the shadows. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably menacing. Tiara's breath quickened. She felt the oppressive weight of the figure's gaze, though its eyes were hidden. It was as if it could see into her very soul, discerning her fears and weaknesses. The shadows around it seemed to respond to its will, elongating and reaching out toward her like grasping fingers. Desperation surged within her. Tiara grabbed a nearby lamp, its base heavy and solid. She held it up as though it were a weapon, the light casting a small, but defiant, circle of brightness. The shadows recoiled slightly, but they quickly regrouped, swirling around the figure with renewed intensity. The figure paused, its form becoming more indistinct, as though the shadows were thickening around it. It tilted its head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost contemplative. Tiara could feel the tension in the air, a palpable force that made every breath feel like a struggle. Without warning, the figure advanced, its movements becoming more deliberate. The shadows around it grew denser, their darkness deepening until it felt like a void. Tiara swung the lamp in a wide arc, the light cutting through the darkness and forcing the figure to retreat momentarily. But the respite was fleeting. The shadows quickly reformed, and the figure came closer, unfazed by her attempts to ward it off. In a frantic bid for escape, Tiara dashed toward the window, pulling the curtain aside with a violent jerk. She was met with the sight of the frost-covered glass, the outside world obscured by a veil of ice. The cold air that rushed in from the slightly ajar window was sharp, a brief, chilling relief from the stifling atmosphere of the room. The figure hesitated, its shadowy form wavering as if uncertain. The wind howled through the window, a mournful cry that seemed to add to the sense of despair. Tiara took advantage of the distraction to make her way toward the door. She turned the handle, but it was locked. Panic surged through her. She had to get out. The sound of the figure's approach grew louder, the whispering voices intensifying. Summoning all her strength, Tiara slammed her shoulder against the door, but it refused to budge. The figure was almost upon her now, its form filling the doorway, blocking her escape. The shadows around it surged forward, and she felt a cold, clinging pressure around her ankles as if the darkness was trying to hold her in place. In a final, desperate act, Tiara grabbed the lamp and threw it at the figure. The glass shattered on impact, the light flickering out as the shards rained down. The figure recoiled, its form dissolving into a chaotic swirl of shadows. For a brief moment, the room was illuminated by the brief flicker of light from the lamp's remaining fragments, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. The shadows around the figure began to retreat, the entity itself melting back into the darkness. Tiara's heart raced as she grabbed the door handle again, her hands trembling. She wrenched the door open, stumbling into the hallway. The oppressive weight of the shadows lifted slightly, but she knew it was only temporary. The house was still very much alive, and the threat was far from over. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, its layout twisting in a nightmarish maze. Every corner she turned, every door she opened, led her further into the labyrinthine interior. The whispers followed her, a constant murmur that refused to fade. Eventually, Tiara found herself in a small, windowless room, its walls lined with old, dusty bookshelves. The room was silent, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. She slumped against one of the shelves, her breathing ragged and uneven. The shadows in the room seemed to move with a life of their own, swirling in slow, mesmerizing patterns. The encounter with the figure had left her shaken, but it had also driven home the gravity of her situation. The house was a living entity, its dark heart beating with malevolence. The figure was merely a manifestation of the darkness that had taken root within its walls. Tiara knew she had to confront the source of the house's power, the box. But as she sat in the dimly lit room, trying to calm her racing thoughts, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The house was growing stronger, its grip tightening with each passing moment. With a heavy heart, she resolved to face the darkness head-on. She would find a way to contain it, to sever the connection between the house and the malevolent force that sought to consume her. The shadows might be relentless, but she had to find a way to break free from their grasp. As she prepared to leave the small room and confront the darkness once more, Tiara steeled herself for the battle ahead. The house was alive, and it would fight back with every ounce of its sinister power, but she would not give in. Not yet. Chapter 8. The Ritual's Echo. Tiara emerged from the small room, her heart still racing from the encounter with the shadowy figure. The house seemed to have quieted, but an oppressive silence hung heavily in the air. Each step she took was tentative, her senses on high alert as she moved cautiously through the labyrinthine corridors. The oppressive darkness had seeped into every corner, casting long, spindly shadows that flickered and twisted in the dim light. As she navigated the narrow hallways, she felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as though the house itself was shifting around her, constantly rearranging its layout. The whispering voices from earlier seemed to have faded, replaced by an almost tangible stillness that weighed down on her shoulders like a physical presence. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the space becoming claustrophobic, as if the house was contracting around her. Her search led her to the basement door, which she had previously avoided. The basement had always been a place of dread, a dark, forgotten part of the house that seemed to hold more than just physical space. Now, it seemed to call to her, an unspoken promise of answers and deeper horrors. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and descended the stairs, each step echoing through the stillness. The air grew colder, heavier, as she descended, and the smell of mildew and decay grew stronger. The basement was a vast, cavernous space, its ceiling low and its corners shrouded in impenetrable darkness. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb that hung precariously from a frayed wire. The basement was filled with old furniture draped in white sheets, dusty boxes, and forgotten relics of a past long gone. It looked like a museum of lost memories, each item covered in a thick layer of dust that spoke of years of abandonment. Tiara wandered through the clutter, her flashlight casting weak beams of light that danced across the surfaces. She was searching for something, anything, that might shed light on the dark force that had taken hold of the house. Her fingers traced the spines of old books, the edges of framed photographs, and the worn surfaces of furniture. There was a sense of unease in the air, a feeling that she was intruding upon something that was never meant to be disturbed. Her search led her to a far corner of the basement, where an old, wooden cabinet stood. Its surface was marred by years of neglect. Its once polished wood now rough and splintered. With great effort, Tiara pried open the creaky doors. Inside, she found an assortment of dusty jars and strange, arcane objects, bundles of dried herbs, faded parchments covered in incomprehensible symbols, and what appeared to be a collection of ritualistic tools. Her eyes were drawn to a particular item, a worn leather book bound with what looked like human skin. The cover was embossed with strange symbols, and the book radiated a sense of ancient power. Tiara hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling as she lifted it from the cabinet. The book felt heavy in her hands, its presence palpable and foreboding. She opened the book carefully, the yellowed pages crackling as they parted. The text was written in a language she could not decipher, but the illustrations were unmistakable, detailed drawings of rituals, symbols, and arcane diagrams. It was clear that the book held knowledge of dark practices, perhaps related to the malevolent force in the house. Tiara's attention was drawn to a particular page, depicting a complex ritual with elaborate symbols and diagrams. The page was marked by an ancient ink that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The ritual described on the page was intended to summon or bind a dark entity, and Tiara realized with a shiver that the house might have been the site of such a ritual long ago. The ritual involved several steps: creating a protective circle, reciting incantations, and using specific objects to channel the dark energy. Tiara's eyes widened as she scanned the instructions, understanding that the box was an integral part of the ritual, its runes and symbols matching those depicted in the book. The realization hit her with a cold clarity. The house, the box, and the shadows were all part of a larger, malevolent design. Determined to uncover more, Tiara continued to study the book. As she flipped through the pages, she found references to the history of the house and its previous occupants, names and dates written in the same dark ink. One entry caught her eye: a description of a ceremony gone wrong, leading to the house becoming a vessel for dark forces. The basement seemed to grow colder still, and Tiara felt an increasing sense of urgency. The shadows in the room began to move, reacting to her presence and the book in her hands. The temperature dropped further, and the flickering light bulb overhead dimmed, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the faint rustling of pages. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang, causing Tiara to jump. The sudden noise shattered the stillness, and she felt a surge of panic. The shadows around her thickened, forming dark, swirling masses that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The light from her flashlight flickered wildly, casting frantic beams of light that struggled to pierce the encroaching darkness. Tiara tried the door, but it was stuck fast, resisting her attempts to open it. The temperature in the room continued to plummet, and she could see her breath misting in the freezing air. The shadows coalesced into a more defined form, and the figure from earlier, the shadowy entity, seemed to manifest in the corner of the room, its form taking shape from the darkness. The figure approached her, its presence exuding an overwhelming sense of dread. Tiara could feel its gaze upon her, even though its eyes were obscured by the shadows. The whispers returned, a cacophony of voices that rose and fell in a chaotic symphony. The room was filled with a sense of impending doom, and the shadows seemed to be closing in on her. Desperate to escape, Tiara grabbed the book and hurriedly stuffed it into her bag. She moved quickly through the cluttered basement, searching for another exit. Her flashlight illuminated a narrow, partially hidden passageway behind a stack of old crates. Without hesitation, she squeezed through the gap and into the passageway, the darkness closing in behind her. The passageway was tight and claustrophobic, the walls pressing in on her as she crawled forward. The air was stifling, filled with the musty smell of years of disuse. Tiara's flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, casting weak beams of light that flickered across the rough walls. She could hear the faint sound of scraping and rustling behind her, the shadows pursuing her through the darkness. As she reached the end of the passageway, she found herself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. The room seemed to be a forgotten part of the house, its purpose long lost to time. In the center of the room stood an old, wooden table covered with strange artifacts and remnants of forgotten rituals. Tiara took a moment to catch her breath, her heart pounding as she looked around the room. The artifacts on the table were similar to those she had seen in the basement: dried herbs, ritual tools, and faded parchments. The room was a shrine to forgotten rites, a place where dark forces had once been summoned and bound. On the wall opposite her, she noticed a large, ornate mirror. The mirror's surface was covered in grime and dust, but as she approached it, she could see faint, distorted reflections of the room behind her. The shadows seemed to move within the mirror, swirling and shifting in a way that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Tiara's gaze was drawn to the mirror's frame, which was intricately carved with symbols and runes similar to those found on the box. The realization hit her. The mirror was not just a reflection of the room, but a portal, a gateway to the dark forces that had been unleashed. As she reached out to touch the mirror, a sudden jolt of energy surged through her, causing her to recoil in shock. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and the shadows within it seemed to come alive, reaching out toward her. Tiara stumbled back, her mind racing with the implications of what she had uncovered. The room felt as though it were closing in on her, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. The shadows in the mirror grew more defined, taking on grotesque, nightmarish shapes that writhed and twisted in the darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, urging her to look deeper, to understand the true nature of the house's power. Tiara fought the urge to turn away, forcing herself to keep her gaze fixed on the mirror. The shadows within seemed to coalesce into a more recognizable form, a dark, formless entity that loomed in the mirror's depths. It was as if the mirror was a window into the very heart of the darkness that had taken hold of the house. With a final burst of determination, Tiara tore her gaze away from the mirror and grabbed the book from her bag. She knew that she had to confront the dark force head-on, to find a way to use the knowledge she had uncovered to break the house's hold over her. The mirror, with its dark reflections and twisted shadows, was a key to understanding the malevolent force that had claimed the house. As she prepared to leave the room, the shadows seemed to recede slightly, the oppressive atmosphere lifting just enough to allow her a moment of respite. Tiara took a deep breath and steeled herself for the challenges ahead. She had to find a way to contain the darkness, to banish the entity that had been unleashed. With the book clutched tightly in her hand, she made her way back through the narrow passageway, the weight of the shadows lifting as she moved. The house was still alive, still an active participant in her nightmare, but she had taken a crucial step toward uncovering its secrets. The darkness might be relentless, but she was determined to fight back, to reclaim her freedom from the malevolent forces that sought to consume her. As she emerged from the passageway and back into the basement, Tiara knew that her journey was far from over. The house was a labyrinth of darkness, its secrets hidden within its walls. But she had a newfound resolve, and with the book's knowledge in her hands, she was prepared to face whatever lay ahead. The ritual's echo was just the beginning, and she was ready to confront the darkness and uncover the truth. Chapter 9. The Unseen Realm. Tiara emerged from the narrow passageway into the basement once again, her senses heightened, her grip on the book firm. The oppressive atmosphere of the basement seemed to have lessened slightly, but the darkness still loomed large, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. The once familiar room had taken on a new, unsettling dimension, its shadows moving with an almost sentient quality. Determined to continue her investigation, Tiara moved toward the table where she had found the ritualistic artifacts. The table was now illuminated by the soft, flickering light of the bulb overhead, casting eerie, elongated shadows that danced across the walls. The old relics and dried herbs seemed to have shifted subtly, their arrangement now appearing more deliberate, almost as if they were beckoning her. Tiara's attention was drawn to a large, ancient book lying open on the table. The pages were covered in arcane symbols and diagrams similar to those in the book she had found earlier. The symbols seemed to shimmer in the dim light, their meanings as elusive as ever. Tiara's eyes were drawn to a particular diagram that depicted a complex web of lines and symbols converging at a central point, a focal point that seemed to radiate a dark, pulsing energy. Her gaze followed the diagram's lines, tracing them to a spot on the floor of the basement. There, partially obscured by a heavy, dusty rug, was a circular pattern etched into the floor. The pattern was similar to the one depicted in the book's ritual diagram. Tiara's heart raced as she approached the circle, her flashlight revealing its intricate details. The circle was surrounded by a series of symbols and runes, their meanings still inscrutable but undeniably ominous. The floor beneath the rug felt colder than the surrounding air, and Tiara could sense a subtle vibration emanating from the circle. She carefully removed the rug, revealing the full extent of the markings etched into the floor. The circle seemed to be part of a larger ritualistic layout, its design suggesting that it was used to contain or channel dark energies. Tiara's thoughts raced as she considered the implications. The house's dark force had likely been harnessed or manipulated through rituals like the one depicted on the floor. The markings might hold the key to understanding how to counteract or break the entity's hold on the house. As Tiara examined the circle, she noticed several small, metallic objects scattered around its perimeter. They looked like old, tarnished coins or tokens, each inscribed with the same runes as the circle. Carefully, she picked one up and examined it closely. The object was cold to the touch, and its surface felt strangely textured, as if it had been worn smooth by years of use. Tiara placed the token back in its position and continued her examination. The basement seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening and thickening. The temperature dropped further, and Tiara could see her breath forming visible puffs in the frigid air. The whispers from before returned, faint and disjointed, weaving through the air like an unsettling melody. Suddenly, the dim light bulb above flickered erratically, casting rapid, strobing shadows across the room. Tiara's flashlight began to dim, its beam growing weaker as if it were being drained by the surrounding darkness. The shadows on the walls writhed and twisted, their movements growing more frenetic and chaotic. Realizing the urgency of her situation, Tiara grabbed the book and turned her attention back to the ritual circle. She knew that the markings and symbols were integral to understanding the house's dark power. With renewed determination, she took out the book she had discovered and laid it open on the table, its pages fluttering slightly in the cold draft. She compared the book's diagrams with the markings on the floor, her eyes tracing the lines and symbols. The ritual described in the book involved several key components: the circle, the tokens, and specific incantations. Though the incantations were not written in the book she had, the visual clues were enough to give her a basic understanding of the ritual's purpose. As Tiara studied the circle and the surrounding artifacts, she noticed a small, hidden compartment in the wall. It was partially concealed by a loose panel of wood. Her curiosity piqued. She pried the panel open, revealing a narrow alcove filled with more ritualistic tools and items. Among them were several glass vials containing dark, murky liquids and a collection of strange, bone-like fragments. Tiara's fingers traced the objects, noting their eerie, unsettling appearance. The vials seemed to contain some form of dark essence, and the bone fragments were inscribed with similar runes as those on the circle and tokens. It was as if the house had been a focal point for dark rituals, its energy channeled through these objects. Her attention was drawn back to the ritual circle. She noticed a particular symbol at its center that matched one of the symbols on the tokens and the bone fragments. The symbol seemed to pulse with a faint, dark light, and Tiara could feel a subtle, almost imperceptible pull emanating from it. The realization struck her. The symbol was the key to understanding the entity's connection to the house. Tiara felt a growing sense of urgency. The shadows around her seemed to be responding to her discoveries, their movements becoming more agitated and threatening. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an unnerving cacophony. The basement's oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in on her, heightening her sense of dread. She decided to perform a basic version of the ritual depicted in the book, using the items she had found. She carefully placed the tokens at specific points around the circle, aligning them with the symbols. She then retrieved one of the glass vials and poured its contents into the center of the circle, watching as the dark liquid spread and pooled. The liquid seemed to react with the markings on the floor, creating a shimmering, dark mist that hovered above the circle. Tiara stepped back, observing the effects of her actions. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and contort, their movements synchronized with the dark mist above the circle. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and the oppressive silence was replaced by a low, rumbling sound that resonated through the walls. As she watched, the dark mist began to take on a more defined shape, forming a swirling, amorphous entity that hovered above the circle. It was as if the ritual had summoned or awakened something within the house, a dark force that had been lying dormant. The entity's form was indistinct, shifting and changing, but its presence was undeniably malevolent. Tiara's heart raced as she realized the gravity of the situation. The entity seemed to be aware of her presence, its dark energy reaching out toward her. The room was filled with an oppressive weight, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows around her seemed to grow more agitated, their movements becoming more frenzied. Determined to understand the entity's nature, Tiara took a deep breath and reached for the book. She knew that she had to gather more information to understand the full extent of the house's dark power. She flipped through the book's pages, searching for any references to the entity or the dark force she had awakened. The book's pages were filled with descriptions of ancient rituals, dark entities, and the ways in which they could be bound or controlled. Tiara found several passages that described methods for dealing with entities similar to the one she had summoned. The rituals involved complex procedures, including the use of specific incantations, symbols, and artifacts. As she read, Tiara felt a growing sense of urgency. The entity's presence was becoming more palpable, its dark energy pressing in on her from all sides. The shadows in the room seemed to be closing in, and the temperature continued to drop. She knew that she had to act quickly, to use the knowledge she had gained to confront the entity and break its hold on the house. Tiara resolved to perform a more advanced version of the ritual, one that would require all the components she had discovered. She gathered the artifacts and items she had found and began to prepare for the ritual. Her movements were precise and deliberate, her mind focused on the task at hand. As she worked, the entity's form became more defined, its presence more menacing. The whispers grew louder, their voices rising and falling in a chaotic rhythm. Tiara's hands trembled as she placed the final items in their designated positions, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. With the ritual nearly complete, Tiara took a moment to steady herself. She knew that she was about to confront the darkest aspects of the house's power, and she had to be prepared for whatever might come. The shadows around her seemed to pulse with anticipation, and the entity's form hovered ominously above the circle. Tiara took a deep breath and began to recite the ritual's incantations, her voice steady and resolute. The words seemed to resonate through the room, their energy mixing with the dark mist and the entity's presence. The shadows reacted to her words, their movements becoming more synchronized with the ritual's progress. As she continued, the dark mist above the circle began to dissipate, its form breaking apart and dissipating into the air. The entity's presence seemed to weaken, its dark energy retreating from the room. The temperature in the basement began to rise, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. Tiara completed the ritual with a final, decisive gesture, her heart racing as she watched the entity's form vanish completely. The shadows in the room seemed to recede, their movements slowing and calming. The whispers faded, leaving behind a profound silence that filled the basement. Exhausted but relieved, Tiara took a moment to gather her thoughts. The house had been quieted, at least for now, but she knew that the dark forces were not entirely vanquished. There was still much to learn and understand about the house's malevolent history and the rituals that had been performed within its walls. As she collected her belongings and prepared to leave the basement, Tiara felt a sense of cautious optimism. She had taken a significant step toward uncovering the house's secrets and confronting its dark power. The ritual had been a crucial part of that process, and she was determined to continue her investigation, no matter how daunting the task might be. The basement, once a place of fear and darkness, now felt quieter and less oppressive. Tiara knew that her journey was far from over, but she had gained valuable insights and knowledge. With the book and the artifacts in hand, she prepared to face the challenges ahead, ready to confront the shadows and uncover the truth about the house's dark legacy. Chapter 10: The Forbidden Chamber. Tiara emerged from the basement, her mind still reeling from the events of the ritual. The house seemed quieter now, its oppressive atmosphere slightly lifted, but an unsettling calm had taken its place. The shadows in the corners of the rooms appeared more stable, though their presence still lingered. Tiara's resolve was stronger than ever. She knew she had to delve deeper into the house's secrets to fully understand its dark history. She made her way back to the main floor, her footsteps echoing through the hallways. The house's silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. The once familiar surroundings now seemed alien and threatening, each room a potential repository of dark secrets. Tiara's attention was drawn to the hallway leading to a part of the house she had not yet explored, a corridor that seemed to twist and turn in a disorienting manner, as if intentionally designed to confuse. At the end of the corridor was a heavy wooden door, its surface covered in intricate carvings and symbols that matched those found in the ritualistic artifacts. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint, otherworldly glow emanated from the crack, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Tiara approached cautiously, her breath catching in her throat as she pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike any she had seen in the house. It was a large, circular chamber, its walls lined with shelves and alcoves filled with ancient, dust-covered tomes and strange artifacts. The chamber was dimly lit by a series of flickering candles placed along the perimeter, their flames casting a warm, yet unsettling glow. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate pedestal, upon which rested an ancient, elaborately decorated box. The box was adorned with dark, intricate patterns and runes, its surface glistening with an unnatural sheen. It seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic energy, as if it contained a dark force waiting to be unleashed. Tiara's eyes were drawn to the pedestal's base, where a series of arcane symbols were etched into the floor. The symbols were similar to those found in the basement's ritual circle, suggesting a connection between the two locations. The chamber's atmosphere was thick with the scent of old parchment and candle wax, and the air felt charged with a palpable, sinister energy. She approached the pedestal, her flashlight casting weak beams of light that flickered over the box's surface. The runes on the box seemed to writhe and shift, their meanings just out of reach. Tiara could feel a faint, almost imperceptible vibration emanating from the box, as if it were resonating with some hidden, dark power. With great care, she reached out and touched the box. The surface was cold and smooth, and she could feel a faint, pulsing energy beneath her fingertips. The box's intricate carvings seemed to come alive, their patterns shifting and changing as she touched them. Tiara hesitated for a moment before lifting the lid of the box, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Inside the box were several items, each more unsettling than the last. The contents included a collection of strange, ritualistic tools, a silver dagger with an intricately carved handle, a bundle of blackened feathers, and a small, leather-bound journal. The journal's cover was marked with the same symbols as the box, and its pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches of dark rituals. Tiara carefully removed the items from the box and laid them out on the pedestal. The dagger's blade gleamed with a malevolent shine, and the feathers seemed to radiate a dark energy. The journal's pages were filled with cryptic symbols and descriptions of forbidden rites. Tiara's eyes were drawn to one particular entry that detailed a ritual involving the summoning of a powerful, malevolent entity. As she read the journal, Tiara realized that the ritual described was far more complex than the one she had performed in the basement. It involved the use of several key components: the dagger, the feathers, and a series of incantations that were not included in the book she had found earlier. The ritual was intended to invoke or control the dark force within the house, using the box as a focal point. Tiara's mind raced as she considered the implications. The house's dark power had been harnessed through rituals like the one described in the journal. The box was a central component of these rites, and its dark energy had likely played a significant role in the malevolent presence that had taken hold of the house. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, unsettling noise, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the walls of the chamber. The candle's flames flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the room. Tiara could feel the air grow colder, the oppressive atmosphere returning with a vengeance. The shadows on the walls began to shift and coalesce, forming dark, amorphous shapes that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The chamber's atmosphere grew heavy, and Tiara could sense the presence of the dark entity she had read about in the journal. It was as if the entity was reacting to her discoveries, its dark power awakening in response to the ritual components she had uncovered. Tiara quickly gathered the items from the pedestal and began to examine the room more closely. She noticed a series of hidden compartments and alcoves in the walls, each containing additional artifacts and relics related to the dark rituals performed in the house. The items ranged from ancient, tarnished chalices to fragments of old, weathered parchment covered in cryptic symbols. The chamber's oppressive atmosphere grew more intense, and the shadows seemed to close in around her. Tiara felt a growing sense of urgency as she realized that the entity's presence was becoming more pronounced. The low, rumbling sound grew louder, reverberating through the chamber and shaking the walls. Determined to uncover more about the house's dark history, Tiara continued her search, her flashlight casting weak beams of light over the hidden compartments. She found several old, dusty books and scrolls, their contents filled with descriptions of dark rituals and forbidden knowledge. The books were written in languages she could not understand, but the illustrations and symbols were unmistakably ominous. Tiara's attention was drawn to a large, ornate mirror mounted on one of the walls. The mirror's surface was covered in a thick layer of grime and dust, but its frame was decorated with intricate carvings and symbols similar to those found on the box and the journal. The mirror seemed to exude a faint, dark energy, its presence adding to the chamber's already oppressive atmosphere. She approached the mirror cautiously, her breath catching in her throat as she wiped away the grime from its surface. As the dust cleared, the mirror's reflection revealed a distorted, nightmarish version of the chamber. The shadows in the reflection seemed to move independently of their physical counterparts, creating an unsettling and disorienting effect. Tiara studied the reflection closely, her eyes drawn to a particular section of the mirror where a dark, swirling vortex seemed to form. The vortex appeared to be a portal, a gateway to another realm or dimension. It was as if the mirror was a window into the very heart of the darkness that had taken hold of the house. As she watched, the vortex in the reflection seemed to pulse and shift, its dark energy growing stronger. The low, rumbling sound from earlier grew louder, and the chamber's oppressive atmosphere became almost unbearable. Tiara felt a surge of fear and determination, knowing that she had to confront the entity and uncover the truth about the house's dark legacy. With renewed resolve, Tiara turned her attention back to the journal and the ritual components. She knew that she needed to perform the advanced ritual described in the journal to fully understand and control the entity's dark power. The mirror's portal might provide a crucial insight into the entity's nature and its connection to the house. Tiara carefully arranged the ritual components on the pedestal, following the instructions outlined in the journal. She placed the silver dagger, the blackened feathers, and the other items in their designated positions, aligning them with the symbols on the floor and the mirror. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation and dark energy. As she prepared to begin the ritual, the shadows in the room seemed to converge on the mirror, their movements synchronized with the swirling vortex in the reflection. The oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, and the low, rumbling sound reverberated through the walls, creating a sense of impending doom. Tiara took a deep breath and began to perform the ritual, her movements precise and deliberate. She used the dagger to trace intricate patterns in the air, the blade's cold edge cutting through the darkness. The feathers were placed in specific positions around the mirror, their dark energy blending with the ritual's components. The vortex in the mirror's reflection grew more intense, its dark energy swirling and pulsing with a menacing rhythm. Tiara continued to follow the journal's instructions, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The shadows in the room seemed to react to her actions, their movements growing more agitated and chaotic. As she completed the final steps of the ritual, the vortex in the mirror's reflection began to shift and change. The dark energy seemed to be drawn toward the mirror, its presence becoming more defined and focused. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and the low, rumbling sound began to fade. Tiara watched with bated breath as the mirror's reflection revealed a new, clearer image of the chamber. The dark vortex had dissipated, leaving behind a calm, serene reflection. The shadows in the room seemed to recede, their movements slowing and calming. The air felt lighter, and the temperature in the chamber began to rise. Exhausted but relieved, Tiara took a moment to collect her thoughts. The ritual had been a crucial step in understanding and controlling the house's dark power. The mirror's portal had provided valuable insights into the entity's nature, and Tiara felt a renewed sense of purpose. As she gathered the ritual components and prepared to leave the chamber, Tiara knew that her journey was far from over. The house's dark legacy was still unfolding, and there were more secrets to uncover. With the knowledge she had gained and the insights from the ritual, she was ready to continue her investigation and confront the shadows that lurked within the house. The chamber, once a place of darkness and dread, now felt quieter and more stable. Tiara knew that she had taken a significant step toward understanding the house's dark history, but there was still much to learn. With the journal and the artifacts in hand, she prepared to face the challenges ahead, determined to uncover the truth and reclaim her freedom from the malevolent forces that sought to consume her. Chapter 11. Echoes of the Past. Tiara left the forbidden chamber with a mix of relief and apprehension. The house's unsettling atmosphere seemed to have shifted, the oppressive weight of its dark power slightly diminished. The flickering candles in the chamber had cast long, trembling shadows, but now, as she made her way back through the dimly lit corridors, the shadows appeared more stable, though still ominous. She returned to the main floor and began to explore the house's other rooms, driven by a need to uncover more about its dark history. Each room she entered seemed to hold a piece of the house's mysterious past, its walls lined with faded photographs, dusty furniture, and forgotten relics. The air was thick with the musty scent of old wood and neglected spaces, and the silence was occasionally broken by the creak of the floorboards or the distant rustling of wind through the broken windows. Tiara's attention was drawn to a small study off the main hall. The room was filled with old, leather-bound books, their spines cracked and worn from years of neglect. The study had an almost nostalgic feel, its walls lined with shelves that held a vast collection of ancient volumes and scrolls. A large, ornate desk sat in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers, inkwells, and a tarnished brass lamp. Tiara approached the desk, her curiosity piqued by the assortment of items scattered across its surface. She began to sift through the papers, her hands brushing away layers of dust. The documents were a mixture of handwritten notes, old letters, and sketches of various symbols and diagrams. Many of the notes were written in a neat, elegant script detailing various aspects of the house's history and the rituals performed within its walls. Among the papers, Tiara found a stack of old, yellowed letters, their edges frayed and torn. The letters were addressed to various individuals, their contents discussing the house's dark history and the enigmatic figure of the house's previous owner, a man named Elias Blackwood. The letters detailed Blackwood's obsession with occult practices and his attempts to harness dark forces through rituals and ceremonies. Tiara carefully read through the letters, piecing together the story of Blackwood's descent into darkness. The letters described how he had acquired the house and transformed it into a focal point for his dark experiments. His writings spoke of a powerful, malevolent entity that he sought to control, and the rituals he performed to bind and manipulate the dark forces. As Tiara delved deeper into the study, she discovered a hidden compartment within the desk. Inside the compartment were several leather-bound journals, their covers embossed with intricate symbols. The journals appeared to be Blackwood's personal records, detailing his experiments, rituals, and interactions with the dark entity. Tiara's heart raced as she opened one of the journals, its pages filled with detailed accounts of Blackwood's ritualistic practices and the dark forces he had invoked. The journals revealed the extent of Blackwood's obsession, his writings describing increasingly elaborate and dangerous rituals. He had performed countless ceremonies to summon and bind the entity, his attempts becoming more frantic and desperate as he struggled to control the dark power he had unleashed. The journals were filled with references to the house's dark history, including descriptions of the Forbidden Chamber and the rituals performed there. Tiara's gaze was drawn to a particular entry that detailed a ritual performed in the house's main hall. The entry described a complex ceremony involving the use of a large, ornate mirror similar to the one she had found in the Forbidden Chamber. The mirror was described as a key component in summoning and controlling the dark entity, its reflective surface acting as a portal to other realms. As Tiara read the entry, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The description of the ritual was chilling, and she realized that the house's dark power was far more complex and dangerous than she had previously understood. The ritual involved a series of steps, including the arrangement of specific artifacts and the recitation of forbidden incantations. The goal of the ritual was to bind the entity to the house, preventing it from escaping or causing harm. Tiara's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, unsettling noise, a low, rhythmic thudding that seemed to come from the walls of the study. The noise grew louder, reverberating through the room and creating a sense of impending dread. The candles on the desk flickered violently, their flames casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. The shadows seemed to coalesce into dark, amorphous shapes, their movements synchronized with the rhythmic thudding. Tiara could feel the oppressive atmosphere return, the air growing colder and heavier. The noise was accompanied by a faint, haunting melody that seemed to echo through the house, creating a sense of disorientation and unease. Tiara quickly gathered the journals and other documents, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that she had to continue her investigation to understand the full extent of the house's dark power and the rituals performed by Elias Blackwood. The study had provided valuable insights into the house's history, but there was still much to uncover. She left the study and made her way to the main hall, where the ritual described in the journal had been performed. The hall was a large, open space, its high ceilings adorned with intricate moldings and decorative elements. The room was dimly lit by the light of the candles scattered around, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. At the center of the hall was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime and dust. The mirror's frame was decorated with the same symbols and carvings found in the Forbidden Chamber and the journals. Tiara approached the mirror, her flashlight casting weak beams of light over its surface. The mirror seemed to exude a faint, dark energy, its presence adding to the hall's already unsettling atmosphere. Tiara carefully cleaned the mirror's surface, revealing the distorted, nightmarish reflection that had been described in the journals. The reflection showed a swirling, dark vortex, a portal to another realm or dimension. Tiara's eyes were drawn to a series of markings on the floor in front of the mirror. The markings were similar to those found in the Forbidden Chamber, suggesting that the mirror and the markings were part of the same ritualistic layout. She examined the markings closely, noting their intricate patterns and symbols. The rhythmic thudding and haunting melody continued to echo through the house, their sources elusive and mysterious. Tiara could feel the presence of the dark entity growing stronger, its malevolent energy pressing in on her from all sides. The shadows in the hall seemed to react to her presence, their movements becoming more agitated and threatening. Determined to understand the ritual described in the journals, Tiara began to arrange the artifacts and items she had discovered. She placed the silver dagger, the blackened feathers, and other ritual components in their designated positions, aligning them with the symbols on the floor and the mirror. The hall seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation and dark energy. As she worked, the mirror's reflection seemed to shift and change, the dark vortex growing more defined and intense. The rhythmic thudding and haunting melody became more pronounced, creating a sense of impending doom. Tiara felt a surge of fear and determination as she prepared to perform the ritual. She began to follow the steps outlined in the journals, her movements precise and deliberate. The ritual involved the use of the mirror as a portal, the arrangement of the artifacts, and the recitation of forbidden incantations. Tiara's heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and resolve as she performed each step, her actions synchronized with the dark energy emanating from the mirror. As the ritual progressed, the dark vortex in the mirror's reflection grew more intense, its energy swirling and pulsing with a menacing rhythm. The shadows in the hall seemed to converge on the mirror, their movements synchronized with the vortex's activity. The oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, and the low, rhythmic thudding reverberated through the walls. Tiara continued to perform the ritual, her focus unwavering despite the growing sense of dread. The mirror's reflection revealed a clearer image of the dark vortex, its energy becoming more defined and concentrated. The ritual's effect seemed to amplify the house's dark power, and Tiara could feel the entity's presence becoming more pronounced. As she completed the final steps of the ritual, the vortex in the mirror's reflection began to stabilize. The dark energy seemed to be drawn toward the mirror, its presence becoming more focused and controlled. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and the rhythmic thudding and haunting melody began to fade. Tiara watched with bated breath as the mirror's reflection revealed a new, calmer image of the hall. The dark vortex had dissipated, leaving behind a serene reflection. The shadows in the room seemed to recede, their movements slowing and calming. The air felt lighter, and the temperature in the hall began to rise. Exhausted but relieved, Tiara took a moment to collect her thoughts. The ritual had been a crucial step in understanding and controlling the house's dark power. The mirror's portal had provided valuable insights into the entity's nature, and Tiara felt a renewed sense of purpose. As she gathered the ritual components and prepared to leave the hall, Tiara knew that her journey was far from over. The house's dark legacy was still unfolding, and there were more secrets to uncover. With the knowledge she had gained and the insights from the ritual, she was ready to continue her investigation and confront the shadows that lurked within the house. The hall, once a place of darkness and dread, now felt quieter and more stable. Tiara knew that she had taken a significant step toward understanding the house's dark history, but there was still much to learn. With the journals and the artifacts in hand, she prepared to face the challenges ahead, determined to uncover the truth and reclaim her freedom from the malevolent forces that sought to consume her. Chapter 12. The Haunting Echoes. The house had taken on a different character since Tiara's last ritual. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, replaced by an eerie calm that belied the darkness that still lingered. Tiara knew she had only scratched the surface of the house's secrets, but the insights she had gained were crucial. The ritual she had performed and the knowledge she had uncovered were steps toward understanding the full extent of the house's dark history. She began her exploration anew, focusing on the areas of the house she had not yet investigated. Her footsteps echoed through the empty hallways, the sound amplifying in the vast, abandoned spaces. The silence was palpable, occasionally broken by the distant creak of old wood or the faint rustle of wind through broken windows. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of her continued investigation. Tiara's attention was drawn to a narrow, winding staircase that led to the upper floors. The stairs were steep and aged, their wooden steps worn smooth from years of use. The air grew colder as she ascended, a chill settling over her skin. The walls of the staircase were lined with faded wallpaper, its once vibrant patterns now a muted blur of colors. The dim light from her flashlight cast long, trembling shadows that seemed to shift and writhe with each step she took. At the top of the stairs was a long, narrow hallway lined with closed doors. The hallway was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling, its light casting erratic shadows on the walls. The doors were old and weathered, their surfaces covered in layers of dust and grime. Tiara's gaze was drawn to one door in particular. It was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. She approached the door cautiously, her breath catching in her throat. The air around the door felt colder, and an unsettling feeling of anticipation washed over her. Tiara pushed the door open slowly, revealing a small, dusty room. The room was sparsely furnished, with only a single, rickety chair and a small, antique table in the center. The table was covered in a thick layer of dust, and a large, ornate mirror stood against the far wall. Tiara's eyes were drawn to the mirror. It was similar in style to the one she had encountered in the main hall, but its surface was covered in a thick layer of grime and cobwebs. The mirror's frame was adorned with intricate carvings and symbols, its reflective surface dark and cloudy. The air around the mirror felt heavy, as if it were a focal point for the room's dark energy. She carefully approached the mirror, her flashlight casting weak beams of light over its surface. As she cleaned away the dust and grime, the mirror's reflection began to clear. The image that emerged was distorted and unsettling, the reflection of the room appearing warped and eerie. The shadows in the reflection seemed to move independently of their physical counterparts, creating a sense of disorientation and unease. Tiara's attention was drawn to a small, leather-bound book lying on the table next to the mirror. The book was worn and weathered, its cover marked with the same symbols as the mirror. Tiara picked up the book and opened it. revealing pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches. The notes detailed various aspects of the house's history and the dark rituals performed within its walls. The book's contents were similar to those in the journals she had previously found, but with additional details and insights. It described the house's original construction and the various owners who had lived there over the years. The notes detailed how the house had become a focal point for occult practices and the various rituals performed to harness and control dark forces. One entry in the book caught Tiara's attention. It described a series of strange occurrences and supernatural events that had plagued the house's occupants. The entry detailed ghostly apparitions, unexplained noises, and sudden, intense cold spots. It was as if the house itself was alive, its dark energy manifesting in various ways to torment those who lived within its walls. Tiara's eyes were drawn to a sketch in the book, depicting a series of symbols and diagrams related to a ritual performed in the room. The sketch showed a complex arrangement of artifacts and symbols, similar to those she had encountered in the Forbidden Chamber and the main hall. The ritual was described as a method for communicating with the entity and seeking its favor or guidance. As Tiara studied the book, she felt a sudden, unsettling draft sweep through the room. The air grew colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to shift and move with a life of their own. The mirror's reflection began to warp and distort, the image of the room becoming increasingly eerie and disorienting. Tiara's heart raced as she realized that the room's dark energy was intensifying. The mirror's reflection revealed ghostly apparitions and shadowy figures, their forms shifting and flickering as if they were trapped between realms. The unsettling feeling of being watched grew stronger, and Tiara could sense the presence of the house's dark entities growing more pronounced. Determined to understand the source of the dark energy, Tiara continued to examine the book and the mirror. She noticed that the book contained references to a hidden chamber within the house, a place where the most powerful and dangerous rituals were performed. The hidden chamber was described as a place of great significance, its location known only to the house's most trusted occupants. Tiara's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, loud noise, a series of sharp, rhythmic bangs that seemed to come from the walls. The noise grew louder, reverberating through the room and creating a sense of impending doom. The mirror's reflection became increasingly distorted, the ghostly apparitions and shadowy figures growing more defined and threatening. The air in the room grew colder, and the oppressive atmosphere returned with a vengeance. Tiara could feel the presence of the dark entities closing in around her, their malevolent energy pressing in from all sides. The shadows in the room seemed to converge on the mirror, their movements synchronized with the eerie reflections. Tiara knew she had to act quickly. She gathered the book and the other items on the table, her movements hurried and frantic. She felt a growing sense of urgency as she realized that the room's dark energy was becoming more powerful and threatening. The mirror's reflection revealed a swirling vortex, a portal to another realm or dimension, and Tiara knew that she had to confront the entity to fully understand the house's dark legacy. She left the room and made her way back to the main floor, her flashlight casting weak beams of light in the dimly lit hallways. The shadows seemed to follow her, their movements erratic and unsettling. The house's oppressive atmosphere had returned, and Tiara could sense the presence of the dark entities growing stronger. She returned to the main hall, where the mirror she had encountered earlier still stood. The mirror's reflection revealed a clearer image of the swirling vortex, its dark energy pulsing and swirling with a menacing rhythm. Tiara approached the mirror, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She arranged the artifacts and items she had discovered in front of the mirror, following the instructions in the book. The air around the mirror felt charged with dark energy, and the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier. Tiara could feel the entity's presence becoming more pronounced, its malevolent energy pressing in on her from all sides. As she prepared to perform the ritual, the shadows in the room seemed to converge on the mirror, their movements synchronized with the vortex's activity. The rhythmic thudding and haunting melody from earlier grew louder, creating a sense of disorientation and dread. Tiara began to follow the steps outlined in the book, her movements precise and deliberate. The ritual involved the use of the mirror as a portal, the arrangement of the artifacts, and the recitation of forbidden incantations. The mirror's reflection revealed a new, clearer image of the vortex, its dark energy becoming more defined and focused. As she completed the final steps of the ritual, the vortex in the mirror's reflection began to stabilize. The dark energy seemed to be drawn toward the mirror, its presence becoming more controlled. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and the rhythmic thudding and haunting melody began to fade. Tiara watched with bated breath as the mirror's reflection revealed a new, calmer image of the hall. The dark vortex had dissipated, leaving behind a serene reflection. The shadows in the room seemed to recede, their movements slowing and calming. The air felt lighter, and the temperature in the hall began to rise. Exhausted but relieved, Tiara took a moment to collect her thoughts. The ritual had been a crucial step in understanding and controlling the house's dark power. The mirror's portal had provided valuable insights into the entity's nature, and Tiara felt a renewed sense of purpose. As she gathered the artifacts and prepared to leave the hall, Tiara knew that her journey was far from over. The house's dark legacy was still unfolding, and there were more secrets to uncover. With the knowledge she had gained and the insights from the ritual, she was ready to continue her investigation and confront the shadows that lurked within the house. The hall, once a place of darkness and dread, now felt quieter and more stable. Tiara knew that she had taken a significant step toward understanding the house's dark history, but there was still much to learn. With the book and the artifacts in hand, she prepared to face the challenges ahead, determined to uncover the truth and reclaim her freedom from the malevolent forces that sought to consume her. Chapter 13. The Hidden Chamber. Tiara's exploration of the house had revealed numerous secrets, but the discovery of the hidden chamber in the book had provided a new lead. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the need to uncover the full extent of the house's dark history. The hidden chamber was said to be a place of great significance, where the most dangerous and powerful rituals were performed. Tiara knew that finding this chamber could offer crucial insights into the entity's true nature and the extent of its influence over the house. With the book in hand, Tiara returned to the main hall, her mind racing with anticipation and curiosity. The mirror in the hall had been a focal point for her recent investigations, but now her focus shifted to finding the hidden chamber described in the book. The house's oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder as she made her way through the dimly lit corridors. She began her search in earnest, examining the walls, floors, and ceilings for any signs of hidden doors or secret compartments. The house was vast and intricate, its layout a maze of interconnected rooms and passages. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper and old, dusty portraits, their subjects staring out with vacant, haunting expressions. The floors creaked with each step she took, and the shadows seemed to move and shift with a life of their own. Tiara's search led her to a small, inconspicuous room at the end of a long hallway. The room was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, their contents hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. The room had an air of neglect, as if it had been forgotten for years. Tiara carefully examined the room, her flashlight casting weak beams of light over the cluttered surfaces. Her attention was drawn to an old, wooden wardrobe against one wall. The wardrobe was large and ornate, its doors covered in intricate carvings. Tiara approached the wardrobe and noticed that it seemed slightly out of place in the otherwise cluttered room. She carefully opened the wardrobe's doors, revealing a collection of old clothes and forgotten belongings. Behind the clothes, Tiara discovered a hidden panel in the back of the wardrobe. The panel was covered in dust and grime, its surface marked with strange symbols and carvings. Tiara's heart raced as she realized that the panel was a potential entryway to the hidden chamber described in the book. She carefully pried the panel open, revealing a narrow passageway leading into darkness. The passageway was cramped and winding, its walls lined with exposed brick and old, rusted pipes. The air in the passageway was cold and stale, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Tiara could feel the oppressive atmosphere of the house intensify as she ventured deeper into the passage. The passageway led to a small, circular chamber at the end. The chamber was dimly lit by a single, flickering candle set on a pedestal in the center. The walls of the chamber were adorned with intricate symbols and diagrams, similar to those found in the Forbidden Chamber and the journals. The chamber had an otherworldly quality, its air thick with a palpable sense of dark energy. Tiara carefully approached the center of the chamber, where the candle flickered and cast eerie shadows on the walls. The pedestal on which the candle was placed was covered in strange symbols and markings, its surface worn and weathered. Tiara examined the pedestal closely and noticed that it held a series of small, antique boxes and vials. She opened one of the boxes and found it filled with a collection of old, dusty artifacts. The artifacts included ritualistic objects such as carved bones, ancient coins, and strange amulets. Tiara carefully examined each artifact, noting their intricate designs and symbols. The artifacts appeared to be related to the rituals performed in the house, their significance becoming increasingly apparent. Tiara's attention was drawn to a large, ornate mirror on the far wall of the chamber. The mirror was similar in style to the one she had encountered earlier, but its surface was covered in a thick layer of grime and dust. The mirror's frame was adorned with elaborate carvings and symbols, its reflective surface dark and cloudy. As Tiara cleaned the mirror's surface, the reflection began to clear. The mirror revealed a distorted and unsettling image of the chamber, its shadows and reflections creating a sense of disorientation and unease. The mirror's reflection seemed to show a swirling vortex, similar to the one she had encountered before. Tiara carefully examined the mirror and the surrounding area, searching for any additional clues or hidden passages. Her gaze was drawn to a series of markings on the floor, arranged in a complex pattern around the pedestal and the mirror. The markings were similar to those found in the Forbidden Chamber, suggesting a connection between the two locations. Tiara carefully examined the markings, noting their intricate patterns and symbols. The markings seemed to form a ritualistic layout, their arrangement suggesting a method for summoning or controlling dark forces. The chamber's design and the artifacts found within it indicated that it had been used for powerful and dangerous rituals. As Tiara continued her investigation, she noticed a hidden compartment in the wall near the mirror. The compartment was covered in dust and grime, its surface marked with strange symbols and carvings. Tiara carefully opened the compartment, revealing a collection of old scrolls and documents. The scrolls and documents were filled with handwritten notes and diagrams, detailing various aspects of the house's dark history and the rituals performed within its walls. The notes described the use of the mirror as a portal to other realms and the various methods for summoning and controlling dark entities. The documents provided valuable insights into the nature of the house's dark power and the rituals performed to harness it. Tiara carefully read through the documents, piecing together the story of the house's dark legacy. The documents revealed that the hidden chamber had been used by Elias Blackwood and his followers for their most dangerous and powerful rituals. The chamber had served as a focal point for their occult practices, its design and layout carefully crafted to channel and control dark forces. The documents also described a series of rituals performed to summon and bind the dark entity that haunted the house. The rituals involved the use of the mirror as a portal, allowing the entity to communicate with its summoners and exert its influence over the house. The documents provided detailed instructions for performing these rituals, including the arrangement of artifacts and the recitation of forbidden incantations. Tiara's investigation revealed that the hidden chamber was a key location in the house's dark history. The rituals performed in the chamber had played a significant role in shaping the entity's influence and the house's malevolent energy. The documents provided crucial insights into the nature of the entity and the methods used to control and contain it. As Tiara continued to explore the hidden chamber, she felt a growing sense of urgency. The house's dark power was becoming more pronounced, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around her. The shadows in the chamber appeared to move and shift with a life of their own, creating a sense of disorientation and unease. Tiara knew that she had to act quickly to uncover the full extent of the house's dark legacy. With the documents and artifacts in hand, she prepared to confront the entity and the malevolent forces that haunted the house. The hidden chamber had provided valuable insights and clues, but there was still much to uncover. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the chamber, Tiara took one last look around the room. The candle on the pedestal flickered and cast eerie shadows on the walls, the mirror's reflection showing a distorted and unsettling image. The chamber was a place of great significance, its dark energy palpable and intense. Tiara left the hidden chamber and made her way back through the passageway, her mind racing with the revelations she had uncovered. The house's oppressive atmosphere seemed to follow her, the air growing colder as she moved through the dimly lit corridors. The shadows in the hallways appeared to close in around her, their movements synchronized with the dark energy of the house. As she returned to the main floor, Tiara knew that her journey was far from over. The house's dark legacy was still unfolding, and there were more secrets to uncover. With the knowledge she had gained and the insights from the hidden chamber, she was ready to continue her investigation and confront the shadows that lurked within the house. The hidden chamber had provided valuable insights into the house's dark history and the nature of the entity that haunted it. Tiara felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination as she prepared to face the challenges ahead. The house's malevolent forces were still active, and Tiara knew that she had to uncover the truth and reclaim her freedom from the darkness that sought to consume her. Chapter 14. The Entity's Descent. Tiara's exploration of the hidden chamber had unearthed crucial information about the house's dark history and the rituals performed within its walls. Armed with this knowledge, she knew that the time had come to confront the malevolent entity that had plagued the house for so long. The oppressive atmosphere had grown heavier, and the shadows seemed to grow more menacing with each passing day. As she made her way through the house, Tiara's determination to confront the entity was unwavering. The house seemed to react to her resolve, the air growing colder and the oppressive energy intensifying. The corridors and rooms felt increasingly claustrophobic, the shadows seeming to press in from all sides. Tiara decided to return to the main hall, where the mirror had served as a focal point in her previous rituals. The mirror had become a key element in her understanding of the entity and its influence over the house. The hall, once a place of dread and darkness, now felt like a crucial battleground in her quest to confront the malevolent force. The journey to the main hall was fraught with tension. The shadows in the corridors appeared to writhe and shift, their movements synchronized with the house's dark energy. The air was thick with a palpable sense of foreboding, and Tiara could feel the presence of the entity growing stronger with each step. Upon reaching the main hall, Tiara was greeted by the familiar sight of the large, ornate mirror. The mirror's surface was still covered in a layer of grime, but she had cleaned it thoroughly during her previous investigations. The mirror had become a focal point for her rituals, its reflective surface revealing glimpses of the entity's dark presence. Tiara arranged the artifacts and items she had collected in front of the mirror, carefully following the instructions outlined in the documents from the hidden chamber. The artifacts included ritualistic objects such as carved bones, ancient coins, and strange amulets. Each item was placed with deliberate precision, their arrangement reflecting the ritualistic layout described in the documents. As she prepared to perform the ritual, Tiara could feel the oppressive energy in the room intensify. The shadows in the hall seemed to converge on the mirror, their movements synchronized with the dark energy of the house. The rhythmic thudding and haunting melody from earlier grew louder, creating a sense of disorientation and dread. Tiara lit a series of candles around the mirror, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The light from the candles illuminated the artifacts and the mirror, creating a stark contrast with the surrounding darkness. The room felt charged with dark energy, and Tiara could sense the presence of the entity growing stronger. She began the ritual by arranging the artifacts and items according to the instructions in the documents. The mirror's reflection revealed a swirling vortex, its dark energy pulsing and swirling with a menacing rhythm. Tiara carefully followed each step of the ritual, her movements precise and deliberate. The ritual involved the use of the mirror as a portal, allowing the entity to manifest and communicate with its summoner. Tiara recited the forbidden incantations from the documents, her voice silent but the actions deliberate. The air around the mirror felt charged with dark energy, the oppressive atmosphere growing heavier with each passing moment. As Tiara performed the ritual, the mirror's reflection began to change. The swirling vortex grew more defined, its dark energy becoming more focused and intense. The shadows in the room seemed to converge on the mirror, their movements synchronized with the vortex's activity. Tiara could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, its malevolent energy pressing in from all sides. The mirror's reflection revealed glimpses of the entity, dark, shadowy figures with shifting forms and unsettling movements. The entity appeared to be manifesting through the mirror, its influence over the house becoming more pronounced. The room's temperature dropped, and an eerie, oppressive silence fell over the hall. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own, their movements synchronized with the entity's growing presence. Tiara could feel the entity's dark energy enveloping her, its malevolent force pressing in from all sides. The ritual reached its climax as Tiara completed the final steps. The mirror's reflection revealed a clearer image of the entity, its dark energy pulsating and swirling with a menacing rhythm. The oppressive atmosphere in the room grew heavier, and the shadows seemed to close in around her. Tiara knew that the entity's influence over the house was now at its peak. The mirror had served as a portal for the entity's manifestation, allowing it to exert its dark power more directly. The ritual had been a crucial step in understanding and confronting the entity, but it also meant that the final confrontation was imminent. The oppressive atmosphere in the room seemed to intensify, and Tiara could feel the entity's malevolent energy pressing in from all sides. The shadows in the hall appeared to grow darker and more menacing, their movements synchronized with the entity's dark presence. The rhythmic thudding and haunting melody grew louder, creating a sense of impending doom. Tiara took a deep breath, steeling herself for the final confrontation. The house's dark legacy was now fully revealed, and the entity's influence over the house had reached its peak. With the knowledge she had gained and the insights from the ritual, Tiara was ready to face the challenges ahead and confront the malevolent force that had haunted the house for so long. As she prepared for the final confrontation, Tiara could feel the entity's dark energy closing in around her. The mirror's reflection revealed a clearer image of the entity, its dark presence looming ominously in the room. The shadows in the hall appeared to converge on the mirror, their movements synchronized with the entity's malevolent influence. Tiara knew that the final confrontation would be a battle of wills and strength. The house's dark power was at its peak, and the entity's influence over the house was now fully manifested. With a determined expression, Tiara prepared to face the entity and reclaim her freedom from the darkness that sought to consume her. The room was charged with dark energy, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around her. The shadows writhed and twisted with a life of their own, creating a sense of disorientation and dread. Tiara could feel the entity's malevolent energy pressing in from all sides, its dark presence palpable and intense. As she took her position in front of the mirror, Tiara knew that the final confrontation was at hand. The house's dark legacy had led her to this moment, and she was ready to face the malevolent force that had haunted the house for so long. With the knowledge she had gained and the ritual she had performed, Tiara was prepared to confront the darkness and reclaim her freedom. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker and more menacing, their movements synchronized with the entity's dark influence. The rhythmic thudding and haunting melody reached a crescendo, creating a sense of impending doom. Tiara steeled herself for the final battle, determined to confront the entity and end the house's dark legacy once and for all. The oppressive atmosphere in the room grew heavier, and Tiara could feel the entity's malevolent energy closing in around her. The mirror's reflection revealed a clearer image of the entity, its dark presence looming ominously in the room. The shadows seemed to converge on the mirror, their movements synchronized with the entity's dark power. Tiara took a deep breath and prepared to face the final challenge. The house's dark power was at its peak, and the entity's influence over the house was fully manifested. With determination and resolve, Tiara was ready to confront the malevolent force and reclaim her freedom from the darkness that sought to consume her. Chapter 15. The Final Confrontation. The house stood in a heavy silence as Tiara prepared for the final confrontation. The oppressive atmosphere had reached its peak, and the air was thick with an intense, palpable darkness. Shadows moved with an unnerving life of their own, converging around the mirror that had become the focal point of her battle against the malevolent entity. Tiara's heart pounded with a mixture of dread and resolve. The mirror's reflection was an unsettling swirl of dark energy and distorted shapes, the entity's presence more pronounced than ever. The ritual had intensified the entity's manifestation, and the final confrontation was imminent. Tiara knew that she had to face the darkness head-on to reclaim her freedom and end the house's curse. In the dimly lit hall, Tiara arranged the remaining artifacts and ritualistic objects around the mirror, creating a protective barrier. The items were carefully placed according to the instructions from the Hidden Chambers documents: carved bones, ancient coins, amulets, and a collection of old scrolls. Each object was positioned with deliberate precision, forming a circle around the mirror that would serve as both a shield and a focal point for the final ritual. Tiara lit the candles around the mirror, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The light from the candles created a stark contrast with the surrounding darkness, highlighting the mirror's surface and the dark energy that seemed to radiate from it. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the rhythmic thudding and the haunting melody that had become a constant presence throughout her ordeal. The mirror's reflection grew more turbulent, the swirling vortex of dark energy becoming more defined and intense. The shadows in the hall seemed to converge on the mirror, their movements synchronized with the vortex's activity. Tiara could feel the oppressive weight of the entity's presence pressing in from all sides, the malevolent energy almost suffocating in its intensity. Tiara began the final ritual, carefully following the steps outlined in the documents. Her movements were precise and deliberate, each action intended to focus and channel the dark energy in the mirror. The ritual required her to perform a series of intricate gestures and movements, each one designed to confront and contain the entity's power. As Tiara performed the ritual, the shadows in the room seemed to respond to her actions. They writhed and twisted, their movements becoming more erratic and aggressive. The air grew colder, and the oppressive atmosphere in the room intensified. The rhythmic thudding and haunting melody reached a crescendo, creating a sense of impending doom. Tiara's focus was unwavering as she continued the ritual. The mirror's reflection revealed a clearer image of the entity, its dark presence looming ominously in the room. The entity's form was shifting and indistinct, a swirling mass of shadows and malevolent energy. Tiara could feel the entity's influence growing stronger, its dark power pressing in from all sides. The final steps of the ritual involved a series of complex gestures and movements designed to bind and contain the entity. Tiara's actions were precise and deliberate, each movement calculated to focus and channel the dark energy. The room was charged with an intense, oppressive energy, and Tiara could feel the entity's malevolent force closing in around her. As the ritual reached its climax, the mirror's reflection grew increasingly turbulent. The swirling vortex of dark energy became more pronounced, its malevolent power surging with a menacing rhythm. Tiara could feel the entity's influence reaching its peak, the oppressive atmosphere in the room almost overwhelming in its intensity. With the final gesture, Tiara completed the ritual. The mirror's reflection revealed a momentary glimpse of calm, the swirling vortex of dark energy becoming more subdued. The oppressive atmosphere in the room began to lift, the shadows in the hall retreating from the mirror. The rhythmic thudding and haunting melody gradually faded, leaving behind a heavy, lingering silence. Tiara took a deep breath, her body trembling from the exertion of the final confrontation. The room was still charged with dark energy, but the oppressive weight of the entity's presence had been significantly reduced. The mirror's reflection now showed a more subdued image, the dark vortex less intense and the entity's form less menacing. Tiara carefully gathered the remaining artifacts and ritualistic objects, placing them back in their respective containers. The candles were extinguished, their flickering flames replaced by the soft, steady glow of a single lamp. The hall, once a place of darkness and dread, now felt quieter and more subdued, the oppressive atmosphere giving way to a sense of tentative calm. The house still held traces of its dark past, but the immediate threat of the malevolent entity had been contained. Tiara knew that the final confrontation had been a significant step in reclaiming her freedom from the house's curse. The entity's influence had been reduced, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, if only slightly. Tiara took one last look around the hall, her gaze lingering on the mirror. The house had been a place of darkness and dread, but the final ritual had marked a turning point in her journey. The oppressive energy that had once consumed the house was now more manageable, and the immediate threat of the entity had been subdued. As she prepared to leave the house, Tiara felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. The final confrontation had been a crucial step in her quest to confront the darkness, but there was still much to uncover and understand. The house's dark legacy was far from over, and Tiara knew that she would have to continue her investigation to fully reclaim her freedom. With a determined expression, Tiara stepped out of the main hall and into the dimly lit corridors of the house. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but the shadows still held a lingering sense of menace. Tiara's journey was far from over, and the house's dark legacy was still unfolding. As she walked through the corridors, Tiara's mind raced with thoughts of the future. The final confrontation had been a significant step in her journey, but there was still much to learn and uncover. The house's dark history was complex and multifaceted, and Tiara knew that she would have to continue her investigation to fully understand and confront the darkness that had haunted the house for so long. Tiara's resolve was unwavering as she prepared to face the challenges ahead. The final confrontation had marked a turning point in her journey, but the house's dark legacy was still unfolding. With determination and strength, Tiara was ready to continue her quest and reclaim her freedom from the darkness that sought to consume her. The house stood in a heavy silence, its oppressive atmosphere giving way to a tentative calm. Tiara knew that her journey was far from over, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The final confrontation had been a crucial step in her quest to confront the darkness, and she was ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. As she left the house, Tiara took one last look back, her gaze lingering on the dark silhouette of the building. The house had been a place of darkness and dread, but the final ritual had marked a turning point in her journey. With a determined expression, Tiara stepped away from the house, ready to face the challenges and uncover the remaining secrets of the darkness that had haunted her for so long.